Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sand-crusted, sun-baked, brutally short life of a man who quite literally built and defended ancient Egypt with his blood, the Egyptian soldier. You've probably seen them in movies, marching in perfect formation with gleaming weapons and fancy headdresses, looking majestic as the desert sun catches their bronze armor. But trust me, being a real ancient Egyptian warrior was nothing like those History Channel documentaries with their dramatic music and shiny reconstructions. It was dirty, exhausting, frequently fatal work, and in most cases, it absolutely sucked. The glamorous Egyptian military you imagine, with their chariots, khopesh swords, and intimidating presence, was actually a machine fueled by human suffering, broken bodies, and souls crushed beneath the weight of pharaonic ambition. That perfect pyramid on your vacation photos, it wasn't just built by exploited laborers. It was protected by men who were essentially disposable weapons with heartbeats. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world for these journeys into history's darker corners. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You were born into the sweltering hierarchical world of ancient Egypt. No golden masks, no elaborate tombs, no fancy titles, just the family mud brick home, calloused hands, and the certain knowledge that your life belongs to Pharaoh. By age 6, you're already aware of your destiny. Your father serves in the infantry, which is a polite Egyptian way of saying human shield with a spear. Your toys? Miniature weapons. Your playground? The dusty training ground where you watch older boys learn to kill and die efficiently. While other village kids chase cats or play Senet, you're learning how not to flinch when an instructor swings a staff at your head. Fun childhood games include Don't Cry When Hit, Carry This Rock Until You Collapse, and everyone's favorite, Pretend That Arrow Didn't Just Pierce Your Friend's Eye. Your father, the soldier, is a frightening, scarred man whose entire vocabulary consists of short, sharp commands and the occasional grunt of disapproval. He teaches you everything: how to hold a shield, how to thrust a spear, how to keep your mouth shut when a superior officer walks by. You don't ask questions. You just observe, absorb, and obey. Mostly because asking questions results in a beating and a week of extra training in the midday sun. Holidays? Nice idea. You don't get those. The Nile doesn't take breaks from flooding, and Egypt's enemies don't take breaks from coveting Egyptian wealth. So neither do you. You learn quickly that free time is just the time between one job and the next. And while you're technically learning a trade, what you're really learning is pain tolerance, heat resistance, and how to fall asleep standing up while wearing 20 pounds of bronze. By the time you hit adolescence, you already smell like leather, sweat, and resignation. Your skin, once soft, now resembles the tanned hide used for shield coverings, except your hide has to keep walking into battle when pierced. This is your life now. Welcome to the mighty Egyptian military. Hope you like sand, blood, and taking orders until your early death. If you thought you'd get a few good years of playtime before the spear came down, think again. Childhood in the world of Egyptian warfare is more of a suggestion than a phase. The moment you can lift a training stick without toppling over, you're drafted. Forget games, toys, or any concept of fun. Your playroom is a training ground filled with sharp objects and older boys practicing how to efficiently separate limbs from bodies. Your official job title might be Apprentice Warrior, but what it really means is do everything no one else wants to do and get beaten anyway. You fetch water, polish weapons, clean blood from training grounds, and try not to become target practice for the archers. All before breakfast, which consists of stale bread that's harder than most of the training weapons. You get paid in food, stern nods, and the occasional grunt of mild approval, which in military language means you didn't completely embarrass your ancestors today. Meanwhile, the other Egyptian children you once knew are out in the fields, maybe herding goats or learning to make pottery. Simple jobs, sure, but ones that involve fewer stab wounds, and a better chance of seeing 30 candle marks on their birthday cakes. You envy them, even if they do smell like cheese and manure. They might grow up to be farmers or craftsmen, humble jobs with humble rewards. You, on the other hand, are learning to make nails from human bodies. Nails that will hold together Egypt's growing empire. If you're lucky, your father lets you swing a practice sword on your own after he points out every single thing you're doing wrong. And don't even think about saying, "I'm tired." That phrase doesn't exist in the barracks. Fatigue is weakness. Burnout is for torches. You keep training, keep sweating, keep smiling, or at least keep from crying where anyone can see. Because in the eyes of your commanders, who are also sometimes your actual father, you're not a child anymore. You're an Egyptian warrior in training, and the training never ends. The military isn't just where you work. It's your entire existence. It dominates your senses, reshapes your muscles, and rewires your brain. By the time you reach your teens, it doesn't just feel like a place. It feels like a living creature, a hot, sandy, violent beast that you must feed, control, and fear. You know the sounds by heart, the bellows of commanders, the clang of bronze on bronze, the screams of the newly recruited facing their first real combat training. There's a rhythm to it, like some brutal desert symphony, and your body moves in time with it, whether you're awake or half asleep from exhaustion. You stop noticing the heat after a while. That's not because it gets easier, it's because you've simply accepted it. Like death or taxes, the Egyptian sun becomes a certainty you simply endure. You know which parts of your armor will scorch your skin, which training grounds have the smallest patch of shade, and which hours of the day are secretly trying to cook you from the inside out. Your skin darkens from sun, not from choice. Your clothes, the same linen kilt and leather straps you wear every day, smell like a mix of sweat, blood, and desperation. You don't own many possessions, but you do own your place in formation, not on paper, mind you. The pharaoh still technically owns you, but in practice, you belong to the Egyptian military machine, a small cog that keeps the chariots rolling. You start to forget what silence sounds like. The shouts, the clash, the march. It's constant. When your unit does go quiet, it's almost unsettling, like missing a heartbeat in a song you've been forced to memorize since childhood. You find yourself twitching when you should be relaxing, as if your body is missing an expected command. Your friends, assuming you've kept any, barely see you. He's probably at training, becomes your default status. You're not a person anymore. You are the spear, a two-legged extension of Egypt's will. And strangely, a part of you starts to embrace it. Not the pain, not the exhaustion, but the feeling when the formation finally moves as one. When the shield wall holds. When your bronze blade finally cleaves instead of bounces. For a moment, you're not just a kid covered in soot and scars. You're a creator, a defender, a necessary gear in the Egyptian war machine. Then the moment passes. The next order arrives, and the fire roars again. Time to get back to work. Your fate was sealed before your first tooth emerged. In ancient Egypt, military service wasn't a career choice advertised on papyrus flyers or announced by town criers. It was inheritance, destiny, obligation, a birthright you never asked for but couldn't refuse. The Egyptian military machine needed bodies, and your body was conveniently available the moment you could stand upright without toppling over. Egyptian society was structured like one of their perfect pyramids. Pharaoh at the top, followed by priests, nobles, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers forming the massive base. But notice something missing from that neat hierarchy. Soldiers. That's because soldiers weren't a separate class. They were extracted from every level below the elite. Think of it as a mandatory subscription service, except instead of monthly payments, you paid with your blood, sanity, and potentially your life. During the Old Kingdom, around 2700 to 2200 BCE, Egypt didn't even maintain a standing army. They simply didn't need one. Surrounded by deserts and relatively weak neighbors, they operated more like a militia system. When needed, The local governor would point at a bunch of farmers and say, "Congratulations, you're temporarily in the army." These poor souls would receive the most basic training, a copper spear, and maybe if they were lucky, a wooden shield that might stop a determined mosquito. But then something inconvenient happened. Egypt's neighbors got stronger. The Hyksos introduced chariots. The Nubians developed better bows. Suddenly, randomly selecting confused farmers wasn't cutting it anymore. Therefore, by the Middle Kingdom, and especially the New Kingdom, Egypt developed a professional military class. Professional, however, doesn't mean voluntary. The conscription system was brutally efficient. Each nome, Egyptian province, had a quota to fill. They needed X number of bodies, and the local officials made sure they got them. If your father served, you served. If your village hadn't provided enough recruits, you served. If you made eye contact with the wrong official on the wrong day, you guessed it, you served. The only exceptions were for the truly elite who could pay their way out, or scribes, who were too valuable scratching hieroglyphics to waste on the battlefield. But what if I don't want to join, you might ask? That's adorable. Ancient Egypt wasn't big on personal choice. They were big on order, continuity, and the divine right of Pharaoh to use you however he saw fit. Refusing conscription wasn't just turning down a job offer. It was religious sacrilege, social suicide, and quite possibly actual suicide if you persisted. Military families had it worst of all. If your father carried a spear for Egypt, you were practically born with one in your hand. Military service became hereditary during the New Kingdom, creating generations of soldiers who knew nothing else. Your great-grandfather fought the Hittites, your grandfather fought the Nubians, your father fought the Sea Peoples, and you? You'll fight whoever's annoying Egypt this decade. It's the family business, and business is always booming because humans never stop finding reasons to kill each other. Age requirements. Let's just say Egypt wasn't too concerned with child labor laws. Training typically began around age 5 or 6. Not full combat training, mind you, but conditioning. You'd start carrying water for the real soldiers, then graduate to equipment maintenance, then basic drills. By age 10, you were handling real weapons. By 14, you were considered ready for battle. Your childhood wasn't just shortened, it was weaponized. The New Kingdom period saw the introduction of foreign mercenaries into Egyptian ranks. Nubians, Libyans, and the famous Shirdan, possibly Sardinians, with their distinctive horned helmets. These warriors actually chose to fight for Egypt, which the average Egyptian soldier found absolutely baffling. Why would anyone voluntarily do this job? But mercenaries were paid better, treated better, and given more freedom. All things the conscripted Egyptian soldier could only dream about while digging latrine trenches in the desert heat. Training began with the basics. How to march in formation without tripping over your own sandals. How to hold a shield so it protects your vital organs instead of just looking decorative. And how to thrust a spear into something softer than the training dummy. The instructors, hardened veterans with more scars than teeth, had a simple teaching philosophy. Pain is an excellent motivator. Mistakes weren't just corrected, they were punished. Forget a command, that's a beating. Drop your weapon, that's a beating. Complain about the beatings? Believe it or not, that's an even worse beating. The military hierarchy was strict and absolutely unforgiving. The chain of command in ancient Egypt wasn't just a concept, it was a religion. Pharaoh sat at the top as the living god of war, though he rarely bothered showing up to actual battles unless there were monuments to be carved afterward. Below him were the generals, typically nobles, who purchased their commissions, rather than earning them through demonstrated competence, a system that worked out exactly as well as you might expect. Under them were various officers, squad leaders, and finally you, the basic infantry soldier, or as the officers called you, expendable spearholder number 4472. Your value to the Egyptian military was approximately equal to the bronze tip of your spear, and arguably less, since the bronze could be melted down and reused after you died. Social mobility within the ranks was theoretically possible, but practically rare. Exceptional soldiers could be promoted, especially during the New Kingdom, when military prowess became more valued. But for most, the rank they entered with was the rank they died with. The famous Gold of Valor flies, golden necklaces given for exceptional bravery, were handed out about as often as pharaohs admitted making mistakes. The irony of Egyptian military service was that it was both a burden and a privilege. While conscription was dreaded, being a soldier did confer certain status. You weren't just a farmer or laborer anymore. You were a defender of Egypt, a tool of Pharaoh's divine will. People in your village might respect you, fear you, or at least pretend to like you when you returned home. Of course, this assumed you returned home with all your limbs attached and your mind somewhat intact, which statistics suggested was optimistic thinking at best. During peacetime, which was rare enough to be considered a clerical error in the cosmic order, soldiers weren't just sitting around polishing their khopesh swords and reminiscing about that time they almost died of dysentery in Kadesh. No, Egypt found plenty of uses for its military manpower. You might be assigned to construction projects, hauling massive stone blocks alongside civilian laborers. You might serve as police, tax collectors, or border guards. The pharaoh's investment in your training and equipment was going to be maximized one way or another. Some lucky few, typically those from wealthier backgrounds or with connections, might be selected for the chariot corps, the elite branch of the Egyptian military. Charioteers were the fighter pilots of their day, racing across battlefields with a driver and a warrior, raining arrows on infantry below. It was considered glamorous, prestigious, and terrifying. The chariots themselves were lightweight, which made them fast, but also about as protective as riding into battle on a papyrus basket with wheels. One wrong turn at high speed, and you'd be testing how well the Egyptian afterlife accommodated soldiers who died by face-planting at 30 miles per hour. But for most, the infantry was their destiny, standing in formation, shields locked, spears forward, hoping the enemy would reconsider their life choices before making contact. The infantry was divided into units of about 200 men, further broken down into 50-man platoons and 10-man squads. Each had standards bearing divine symbols, falcons, bulls, or other manifestations of Egyptian gods who, despite their divine power, seemed perfectly content watching thousands of humans skewer each other without intervention. Your equipment was standardized, but not necessarily provided. Wealthy families were expected to outfit their own sons. Poorer conscripts got whatever the military had on hand, which might be new, used, or previously owned by someone who didn't dodge fast enough. Your kit included a spear, shield, some form of copper or bronze blade, and if you were lucky, a leather cap that pretended to be a helmet. Armor was rare for common soldiers. Linen padded with layers might be your only protection, which worked about as well against bronze weapons as tissue paper works against rain. As you stand in formation for the first time, sweating under the merciless sun, surrounded by other terrified young men pretending not to be terrified, the reality sets in. This isn't a temporary inconvenience. This isn't something you'll do for a season before returning to normal life. This is your life now. You belong to Egypt, your body, your future, your very breath, all property of Pharaoh. And as the drill instructor walks down the line, inspecting each recruit with the kind of scowl that could curdle milk, you realize the next phase of your military journey is about to begin. The real training. The process that will either transform you into a proper Egyptian warrior or break you completely, probably both. The first day of real training begins not with inspiration, but exhaustion. You're woken before Ra's light touches the horizon, yanked from sleep by a kick to your ribs, or a splash of Nile water if your instructor is feeling particularly generous. No gentle transition, no encouraging speech, just immediate, disorienting action. Welcome to the transformation from human to weapon. It's going to hurt. A lot. Your training ground isn't a specialized academy with state-of-the-art facilities. It's a dusty field baking under the Egyptian sun, scattered with stones, scorpions, and the occasional unexplained bloodstain from yesterday's graduates. Your instructor, A man whose face resembles a dried date with eyes doesn't introduce himself. Names create connections. You're not here to connect. You're here to be broken and rebuilt into something Egypt can use. Physical conditioning comes first because a dead soldier is an inefficient use of resources. You run until your lungs burn and your legs collapse. Then you run more. You carry stones, logs, and sometimes your fellow recruits when they fall. The weight isn't just to build strength. It's to simulate carrying wounded comrades from battle, or more realistically, carrying their bodies back for proper burial rites. Can't have Egyptian soldiers feeding the jackals in foreign lands. The gods wouldn't approve. The instructors have a saying, sweat in training, blood in battle. Except there's plenty of blood in training too. Blisters burst on your feet, leaving bloody footprints in the sand. Calluses form on your hands, then tear open, then form again, thicker, harder. Your body isn't becoming stronger so much as it's becoming numb to a specific category of suffering. Pain isn't an alert system anymore. It's background noise. Weapons training begins with the basics: spear, shield, and simplicity. The Egyptian military isn't looking for artistic warriors or creative fighters. They want consistency, predictability, and obedience. You learn to thrust a spear exactly like the man beside you, to raise your shield at precisely the same angle as everyone else. Individuality is a liability in formation fighting. The spear drills continue until your arm trembles uncontrollably and you can't feel your fingers, then continues several hours beyond that point. Again, barks the instructor after you've performed the same thrust 500 times. Again, he demands when your muscles scream and your vision blurs. Again, when you collapse. The only acceptable response is to stand and continue. Some don't get up. They're dragged away, their training permanently complete. You never ask what happens to them. Questions aren't encouraged in Egyptian military training. Neither is curiosity, compassion, or basic human dignity. After spears come other weapons: the khopesh with its curved blade designed for hooking enemy shields or limbs, the axe for crushing armor, the bow for those with the aptitude. Each introduces new ways for your body to fail, and new opportunities for the instructors to demonstrate their creative approach to motivation through fear. Drop a weapon? Run 10 laps carrying a boulder? Improper grip? Stand in the sun holding your shield overhead until you collapse? Hesitation? That's a special offense requiring special correction, usually involving a demonstration of what happens to hesitant soldiers in battle. Mock battles are the worst: confused, chaotic, and concussion-inducing. Two groups of trainees face off with wooden weapons and minimal instruction. The resulting mess bears little resemblance to actual combat tactics, but it serves multiple purposes: identifying natural leaders, weeding out the hopelessly incompetent, and teaching an essential lesson: battle is chaos, and chaos hurts. These exercises frequently result in broken bones, knocked out teeth, and the occasional eye loss. Medical treatment consists mainly of telling you to stop bleeding on the training ground. The hierarchy among recruits establishes itself quickly and brutally. Natural athletes rise to informal leadership positions. The weak become targets, not just for instructors, but for fellow trainees looking to divert attention from their own shortcomings. It's a simple ecosystem: predator, prey, and the desperate middle trying to avoid becoming either. You learn to navigate this social battlefield as carefully as the physical one. Make allies, avoid enemies, and never, ever stand out too much in either direction. But physical training is only part of the transformation. The more insidious aspect is psychological conditioning. Egyptian military training isn't just teaching you to fight, it's teaching you to kill without hesitation and die without complaint. Both require overriding basic human instincts. The natural aversion to taking human life is systematically dismantled through dehumanization of the enemy. Hittites, Nubians, Libyans, Sea Peoples, they're not people, they're obstacles. They're not killed, they're removed. Their deaths aren't tragedies, their successful operations. Meanwhile, your own survival instinct is recalibrated. Self-preservation takes a back seat to unit preservation. Your life is less important than the mission, the formation, the battle line. This lesson is reinforced in countless drills where individual action is punished and collective success rewarded. When one fails, all suffer. When all succeed, the reward is simply not suffering. It's a crude but effective method that creates warriors who fear their commanders more than the enemy. Religion plays its part in this psychological reshaping. You're not just fighting for Egypt, you're fighting for the gods themselves. Amun-Ra, the war god, watches your performance. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of battle, thirsts for the blood of Egypt's enemies. Blood you're responsible for providing. These aren't just stories to you anymore. They're motivation, justification, and the promise of a decent afterlife if you die with sufficient glory. A marketing strategy for self-sacrifice that has worked remarkably well throughout human history. Sleep deprivation becomes a training tool and a way of life. Random night alarms, dawn marches, and midnight drills ensure you never fully rest. The resulting hallucinations are considered a feature, not a bug. A tired mind is a compliant mind, less likely to question orders or notice the fundamental absurdity of marching toward people who want to kill you. You learn to function in a perpetual haze, making decisions through muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Food becomes fuel, nothing more. The military diet is simple, repetitive, and barely sufficient. Bread, onions, garlic, and occasional beer. Meat is rare, reserved for officers or special occasions. The constant hunger serves two purposes: keeping you aggressive and reminding you of your place in the hierarchy. The promise of a decent meal becomes powerful motivation. Men who might hesitate to kill for glory will charge without question for the promise of a handful of dates or a piece of roasted goat. Injury is expected and largely ignored. Training accidents create a steady stream of broken bones, dislocated joints, and concussions. Most heal incorrectly, leaving lasting damage. By the time your training is complete, you've likely accumulated several permanent souvenirs: a finger that won't straighten, a shoulder that dislocates in the rain, a knee that catches mid-stride. These aren't treated as disabilities, but as character development. Pain is your constant companion, your most loyal friend. The worst injuries, though, leave no visible marks. The psychological trauma of constant fear, sleep deprivation, and dehumanization reshapes your mind as surely as training reshapes your body. Nightmares become routine, emotional responses flatten. You laugh at things that should horrify you and remain stone-faced during moments of joy. Your family, if you see them, notices the change. You're physically present, but somehow not there. The boy who left is not the man who returned. As weeks turn to months, the training changes you in ways beyond muscle and skill. Your posture, your walk, your gaze, all transform. You stand differently, more alert, perpetually ready. You scan crowds automatically, assessing threats. You flinch at sudden movements and sleep with one eye, metaphorically open. These changes aren't conscious. They're rewired instincts, the creation of a different kind of animal. Surprisingly, moments of pride emerge from this brutal process. The first time you complete a march that would have killed you weeks earlier. The moment your spear hits the target center perfectly, drawing a rare nod from the instructor. The day you realize you're no longer at the bottom of the recruit hierarchy. These small victories sustain you, providing just enough reinforcement to keep you moving forward through the pain and exhaustion. By the end of training, roughly 1 in 5 of those who started with you are gone, dead, crippled, or simply disappeared. No announcements are made, no memorials held. They are unspoken lessons about failure and consequence. You don't mourn them because you can't afford to. Besides, you'll need to save your grief for later. The real losses are still ahead. When training finally ends, there's no graduation ceremony, no commemoration of your achievement. One day, you're simply told to gather your equipment and join your assigned unit. The transition from trainee to soldier happens without fanfare. You've survived the forging process, but the true test, actual combat against enemies who don't care about your training regimen, still awaits. As you march away from the training grounds for the last time, muscles aching and mind numb, you realize something has fundamentally changed. The civilian you once were is dead, replaced by something harder, duller, and more durable. You've become what Egypt needed, not a person but a component, a standardized piece of its military machine. The question that haunts you, though you'd never speak it aloud, was the cost worth it? The answer waits in the daily reality of military life, in the monotony between battles and the chaos of combat itself. You're about to discover that training, for all its brutality, might have been the easy part. Surviving training doesn't mean your suffering has ended. It just means it's evolved into a more routine form of misery. The daily life of an Egyptian soldier isn't the glorious existence depicted in temple carvings. There are no pharaohs handing you golden flies of valor, no adoring crowds throwing lotus flowers, no grand processions where you march proudly with captured enemies. Instead, there's dust, discomfort, and the special brand of boredom that only militaries throughout history have perfected. Hurry up and wait. Your new home is wherever the army tells you to plant your bedroll. During peacetime, that might be a permanent garrison, mud brick structures built near strategic points like fortresses, border crossings, or important cities. These barracks aren't exactly luxury accommodations. Picture a room designed by someone who hates humans and loves sardines. Dozens of men crammed into spaces meant for half that number, sleeping on reed mats, breathing each other's fumes, and sharing each other's parasites. Privacy becomes a distant memory, like your childhood or the taste of decent food. If you're stationed at a border fortress, like those dotting the edges of Egypt's empire, conditions are marginally better. At least these structures were designed with some military purpose in mind, but they're also isolated, stuck in barren landscapes where the only entertainment is watching sand change position. These fortresses, particularly those in Nubia or the Sinai, are as much a prison for you as they are protection for Egypt. You're effectively exiled to the edge of civilization, guarding against enemies that might never come, while the real enemy, mind-numbing monotony, attacks daily. During campaigns, home becomes even more temporary. You sleep in vast tent camps, organized with geometric precision that would impress a modern urban planner. The Egyptian military is nothing if not orderly. Your personal space consists of the ground beneath your sleeping mat, and perhaps a small cloth bag for your meager possessions. Campaign camps are small cities that appear and disappear overnight, complete with command tents, supply areas, and designated latrine zones that no one wants to dig, but everyone has to use. Your daily schedule is dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the whims of your commanders. Dawn arrives with a horn blast or drum signal, yanking you from whatever nightmare or dreamless exhaustion passed for sleep. You rise, perform whatever morning ablutions are possible with minimal water, usually just enough to make your face slightly less dirty, and begin the day's duties. Physical training never ends. Even seasoned soldiers drill daily, maintaining the muscle memory that might save their lives in battle. Spear thrusts, shield formations, marching drills. The same movements repeated until they become automatic, thoughtless. Your body moves through the motions while your mind wanders, thinking about home, food, or the strange rash that's spreading across your back. The Egyptian military doesn't believe in rest days. Even during religious festivals, soldiers maintain a rotation of essential duties. When not drilling, you're working. The Egyptian army doesn't waste manpower by letting soldiers sit idle. There are always walls to repair, equipment to maintain, supplies to move, latrines to dig, and in peacetime, massive construction projects to complete. Remember those massive monuments Egypt is famous for? Guess who provided much of the labor? That's right, you and your fellow soldiers, hauling blocks, digging foundations, and building the eternal glory of a pharaoh who might not remember your regiment exists. Food is consistent in only one aspect, its mediocrity. The military diet centers around bread, the cornerstone of Egyptian nutrition. Not the fresh, aromatic loaves found in city bakeries, but dense, often stale rations that could double as weapons in a pinch. This is supplemented with onions, garlic, beans, and occasional dried fish, foods chosen for storage capability rather than flavor. During campaigns, these rations become even more basic, sometimes reduced to just bread and water when supply lines stretch thin. Beer is the one bright spot in this culinary wasteland. Lower in alcohol than modern varieties but higher in nutrition, Egyptian beer is both hydration and liquid courage. Rations vary, but most soldiers receive a daily allowance. Not enough to get drunk, commanders aren't fools, but enough to make the rest of your existence marginally more tolerable. On special occasions or after victories, these rations might increase, leading to the only times you'll see your stone-faced comrades actually smile. Hygiene is a concept with flexible interpretation in military camps. Water is precious, especially in desert regions, so bathing becomes a luxury rather than routine. You adapt to a persistent layer of grime, dust, and sweat that becomes almost like a second skin. Your linen kilt, once white, now exists in a permanent state of dingy grey-brown. You wash it when possible, but clean is a relative term in a world without soap as we know it. Disease spreads through military camps like fire through papyrus. Dysentery is so common it's practically considered a normal bodily function. Parasites, both internal and external, are constant companions. Lice explore your scalp like it's prime real estate. Intestinal worms compete for whatever nutrition you manage to consume. Malaria haunts camps near wetlands, bringing fever cycles that can incapacitate entire units. The medical corps, such as it exists, has limited remedies. Egyptian medicine is an uncomfortable blend of practical knowledge and mystical nonsense. For every effective herbal treatment, there's a bizarre ritual involving animal dung and incantations to Sekhmet. Your best defense against illness is your own gradually acquired immunity. If something doesn't kill you the first time, you might survive it the next. Relationships within the ranks are complex, forged in the crucible of shared suffering. Your fellow soldiers aren't friends in the conventional sense. They're more like reluctant family members. You didn't choose them, you often don't like them, but you're bound to them by circumstance and mutual dependence. You know their habits, their weaknesses, their smells. You can identify them by their silhouettes or their snoring patterns. The bond isn't quite friendship, but something deeper and stranger. The knowledge that in battle, these annoying, crude men are all that stand between you and eternity. Officers exist in a different reality. The gap between common soldiers and military leadership isn't just rank. It's a yawning social chasm. Officers come from higher social classes, live in separate quarters, eat better food, and generally treat the infantry as animated equipment rather than humans. Some commanders earn genuine respect through competence and fair treatment. Others are feared, hated, and occasionally found with mysterious spear wounds after particularly chaotic battles. Fragging, it seems, is an ancient military tradition. Entertainment and leisure time are concepts the Egyptian military acknowledges reluctantly. When duties end, you might have brief periods for socializing, gaming, or crafts. Senet, a board game found throughout ancient Egypt, is popular among soldiers who can access or create game sets. Dice games and gambling flourish despite official disapproval. Stories are shared around fires. Tales of past battles, boasts of female conquests, mostly fictional, and legends of Egypt's glory that sound nothing like the muddy, bloody reality you experience daily. Religious observance remains important, even in military life. Egypt's gods are not distant figures, but present forces affecting daily reality. Amun-Ra, patron of warriors, receives prayers before battle. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of both destruction and healing, is petitioned during illness. Small shrines exist in permanent garrisons, and priests sometimes accompany larger forces. Your personal piety might increase in this environment. There are no atheists in foxholes, or whatever the ancient Egyptian equivalent of foxholes might be. Sleep, when it finally comes, is a precious commodity in short supply. Guard duty rotations ensure that someone is always awake, watching for threats, both external and internal. Your sleep schedule becomes fragmented, conditional, and never quite sufficient. You learn to grab rest in small increments, during breaks, on marches, even standing in formation. Your body adapts to this new normal, functioning on a perpetual energy deficit that becomes your baseline state of existence. Mail and communication with home range from sporadic to non-existent, depending on your posting. If you're stationed near your home region, family might occasionally visit, bringing small comforts and reminders of civilian life. Those deployed to distant frontiers might go years without news from home. Stories circulate of men returning from campaigns to find their wives remarried, their children grown unrecognizable, or their entire families claimed by disease or famine. The emotional toll of this separation is never acknowledged officially, but weighs heavily on every soldier's mind. The psychological impact of military life extends beyond battlefield trauma. The monotony, the loss of autonomy, the disconnection from civilian society, these grind away at your sense of self. Some soldiers adapt, finding identity and purpose within the military structure. Others retreat inward, becoming hollow versions of themselves, going through motions without engagement. A few break completely, deserting despite severe punishments or finding more permanent escapes through self-harm. Time passes differently in this life. Days blur together in an endless cycle of similar activities. Seasons change, bringing new discomforts. Summer's blistering heat, winter's surprising chill, the misery of rain turning camps to mud pits. Years accumulate almost without notice. You track time by campaigns, by commanders, by scars acquired and comrades lost. One day you realize you've spent more life in uniform than out of it, and civilian existence feels like a distant dream. For all this daily misery, there's a strange comfort in the routine, in knowing exactly what's expected, in being part of something larger than yourself. The very predictability that chafes also stabilizes. The brotherhood that forms, however reluctantly, provides a support system unlike anything in civilian life. You endure because everyone endures. You continue because stopping isn't an option. But the rhythm of military life isn't just drills and duties. It's punctuated by something far more consequential, actual combat. And as predictable and structured as daily life might be, battle is its chaotic, terrifying opposite. All the training, all the preparation, all the daily suffering is merely prelude to those moments when you face an enemy determined to ensure you never see another Egyptian sunrise. And for those moments, you need more than discipline and routine. You need the tools of your deadly trade, the weapons and armor that might make the difference between returning to your dreary barracks or becoming food for foreign scavengers. Your relationship with your equipment is complicated. On one hand, these tools will potentially save your life. On the other hand, they're heavy, uncomfortable, and about as technologically advanced as a modern toddler's art project. But these crude implements, your spear, shield, and whatever else Egypt's weapon masters have grudgingly provided, are all that stand between you and a painful death in some dusty corner of the ancient world. Time to get acquainted with your new best friends. The evolution of Egyptian weaponry tells a story of pragmatic adaptation rather than innovative brilliance. In the early dynastic period and Old Kingdom, roughly 3100 to 2200 BCE, weapons were almost embarrassingly primitive: copper maces, simple daggers, and wooden clubs that wouldn't look out of place in a caveman's hands. Effective? Against unarmored humans, sure. Revolutionary? Hardly. The basic copper spear and shield combination remained essentially unchanged for centuries because, well, it worked well enough. And ancient Egypt wasn't big on fixing things that weren't catastrophically broken. The Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1782 BCE, saw some improvements, primarily the wider adoption of bronze. Bronze is copper alloyed with tin, creating a metal significantly harder and more durable than pure copper. This metallurgical upgrade meant weapons that held their edge longer and could actually penetrate something tougher than wet papyrus. The introduction of the khopesh, that distinctive curved sword that's halfway between a sword and a sickle, also dates to this period. Progress, but at the pace of a three-legged tortoise wading through mud. It wasn't until the New Kingdom, 1570 to 1069 BCE, when Egypt faced technologically superior enemies like the Hittites, that necessity forced genuine innovation. Suddenly, the Egyptian military found itself needing to catch up with the foreign weapons pouring into the region. Better bronze alloys, imported iron, though never widely adopted during most of Egypt's glory days, and more sophisticated bow technologies all appeared during this arms race. For ordinary soldiers, though, these improvements trickled down slowly, if at all. The elite got the cutting-edge gear, while you made do with whatever hadn't completely fallen apart from the last campaign. Your primary weapon, regardless of era, is the spear, simple, reliable, and mass-producible. Early versions feature copper tips, later ones bronze, attached to wooden shafts typically made from local acacia or imported cedar for officers. The spearhead is designed with a socket that fits over the shaft, secured with cord or pins. It's not exactly high-tech, but it has two essential qualities. It keeps enemies at a distance, and the pointy end makes them reconsider their career choices when aimed at vital organs. Using a spear effectively requires less skill than a sword, but more discipline. Egyptian tactics depend on formation fighting, with spears presented as a unified wall of points. Your training doesn't focus on becoming an individualistic spear-fighting hero. This isn't a Greek epic. Instead, you learn to maintain position, thrust in unison, and present an unbroken line to charging enemies. Effective, but about as glamorous as being a particularly dangerous brick in a wall. The Egyptian shield evolves from a simple rectangle of animal hide stretched over a wooden frame to a more sophisticated curved design that better protects the body. New Kingdom shields feature a distinctive curved top, giving better protection to the head and shoulders. Some have central hand grips, others use straps, but all share the same basic purpose, stopping pointy things from entering your body cavities. These shields are surprisingly heavy, especially when held at fighting position for hours during battle. The physical strain of shield bearing is one of those military realities temple carvings conveniently omit. Your left arm develops distinctive muscles from constantly holding this weight, creating that asymmetrical shield-bearer physique common among infantry veterans, if they live long enough to develop it. The khopesh becomes Egypt's iconic melee weapon during the New Kingdom, though it's primarily an officer's weapon rather than standard infantry issue. This curved sword, resembling a sickle with a straightened section near the hilt, is designed to hook behind enemy shields or catch limbs. The inner curve delivers devastating slashing attacks, while the tip can be used for thrusting. It's more versatile than a simple straight blade, but requires significant training to use effectively. As a common soldier, you might be issued a simpler, cheaper straight blade for close combat when your spear isn't practical. Bronze weapons present unique challenges. They're harder than copper, but still substantially softer than iron or steel. Your blade dulls quickly in combat, becoming less effective with each strike against armor or bone. Bronze also has an unfortunate tendency to bend rather than maintain rigidity when subjected to strong forces. In the midst of battle, the last thing you want is a sword that suddenly decides to take a nap, folding over like a tired palm frond after a solid impact. Maintenance becomes a crucial daily ritual. You learn to straighten bent weapons, sharpen dulled edges, and secure loosened fittings using simple tools and techniques passed down through generations of soldiers. Failing to maintain your equipment isn't just negligence, it's potential suicide. Officers inspect weapons regularly, punishing those whose gear doesn't meet standards. Not out of concern for your safety, mind you, but because poorly maintained equipment reduces unit effectiveness. You're still just a component in the military machine, and components need to function properly. The axe serves as both tool and weapon in the Egyptian military. Early battle axes feature semicircular copper or bronze blades attached to wooden handles with cord and adhesive. Designs that work well enough for splitting firewood, but have an alarming tendency to separate during vigorous combat. Later versions improve the attachment method with sockets and tangs, but remain fundamentally simpler than contemporary Hittite or Mesopotamian axes. As a weapon, the Egyptian axe excels at one thing: delivering massive trauma through armor or shields. Subtlety is not its strong suit. For ranged combat, Egypt relies primarily on the bow. The simple self-bow, made from a single piece of wood, gradually gives way to the more powerful composite bow, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together. These composite bows, often imported from or inspired by Asian designs, deliver significantly more power and range, but are expensive and vulnerable to Egypt's humid climate, which can separate the laminated layers. Consequently, composite bows remain primarily the domain of specialized archer units and chariot warriors, while common infantry make do with simpler designs. Arrow technology follows a similar path of gradual improvement. Early arrows feature simple stone or hardened wood tips, while later periods see copper and bronze arrowheads in various shapes, optimized for different purposes. Broad hunting tips for unarmored targets, narrow armor-piercing points for protected enemies. The adoption of feather fletching improves accuracy, though the quality of these components varies wildly depending on supply conditions and your unit's priority in the equipment hierarchy. Armor presents a complex trade-off in ancient Egypt's climate. Heavy protection means increased heat stress, dehydration, and reduced mobility, potentially more dangerous than enemy weapons in certain conditions. Consequently, Egyptian armor tends toward the lighter end of the spectrum compared to contemporaries in cooler regions. For most of Egypt's military history, the standard infantry armor consists primarily of quilted linen. Multiple layers of fabric are sewn together to create a padded garment that provides modest protection against glancing blows and some cushioning against blunt force. It's better than nothing, but calling it armor is like calling a palm leaf a roof. Technically accurate but optimistic in terms of actual protection. During the New Kingdom, scale armor appears for elite units and officers. Small bronze plates are attached to a leather or linen backing, creating a flexible protective layer that can actually stop or deflect many Bronze Age weapons. But don't get excited. As a common soldier, you'll rarely see this level of protection unless you're assigned to the Pharaoh's personal guard or similar prestigious units. Your quilted linen will have to suffice, perhaps supplemented with strategic leather reinforcement if your unit commander is feeling unusually concerned about your survival. Helmets follow a similar pattern of limited distribution. The iconic blue kepresh, war crown, worn by pharaohs in battle scenes, was likely made of specialized material like leather with metal reinforcement, effective but far too expensive for mass production. Officers might receive leather caps with metal reinforcement, while common soldiers typically make do with thick cloth wrappings or nothing at all. Your skull's natural bone protection is considered sufficient against most hazards, with the shield expected to handle the rest. This calculus proves tragically optimistic with depressing regularity. The physical burden of carrying this equipment creates its own hazards. A full kit, including shield, spear, secondary weapon, minimal armor, water container, rations, and various personal items, weighs around 20–30 pounds. Not excessive by later military standards, but significant when marching through desert heat or standing in formation for hours. The weight distribution is typically poor by modern standards, leading to chronic back, shoulder, and joint problems that become the constant companions of veterans. During the New Kingdom, chariots revolutionized Egyptian warfare, though not necessarily for the infantry. These lightweight, two-wheeled vehicles typically carry two men, a driver and a warrior, armed with a bow or javelins. Chariots aren't tanks. They're mobile firing platforms designed for rapid strikes, harassment, and pursuit rather than breaking infantry formations. Their primary advantage is mobility, allowing Egyptian forces to concentrate firepower where needed and pursue fleeing enemies. For you as an infantryman, chariots present a mixed blessing. Allied chariots provide tactical support and morale-boosting presence, but they also kick up choking dust clouds occasionally run over their own infantry when maneuvering in battle chaos, and generally receive disproportionate glory for their contributions. Enemy chariots, meanwhile, are terrifying death machines that can appear suddenly on your flank, raining arrows before disappearing again. Learning to form rapid anti-chariot formations becomes an essential skill, particularly during the New Kingdom, when chariot warfare reaches its peak. The sling, often overlooked in discussions of Egyptian warfare, serves as an inexpensive but effective ranged weapon. Using braided flax or other fibers, these simple devices hurl stones or clay projectiles with surprising force and accuracy in trained hands. While not as prestigious as the bow, slings require minimal resources to produce and maintain, making them popular supplementary weapons among infantry units. The ammunition, riverstones or baked clay pellets, costs essentially nothing, an important consideration for a military that counts every copper deben spent on equipment. One aspect of Egyptian military equipment that's rarely discussed is its psychological impact. Your weapons aren't just tools, they're extensions of identity. The way you carry your spear, maintain your shield, or wear your minimal armor becomes part of who you are as a soldier. Veterans develop almost superstitious attachments to particular weapons that have served them well, attributing personalities and protective qualities to inanimate objects. In a world where survival seems partially determined by chance, these beliefs provide comfort, even if the officers mock them privately. Equipment disparities between units create inevitable tension. The Pharaoh's guard receives the finest weapons and actual metal armor. Chariot warriors get composite bows and decorative arm guards. Specialized archer units receive carefully selected arrows with standardized weights for predictable trajectories. Meanwhile, your infantry unit gets whatever's available from the quartermaster, often recycled from dead soldiers with minimal refurbishment beyond wiping off the previous owner's dried blood. The greatest irony of Egyptian military equipment is how little it changes despite centuries of warfare. The basic infantry kit from 1500 BCE wouldn't look dramatically different from that used 500 years earlier. Innovation happens slowly, conservatism rules equipment decisions, and your survival remains dependent on technologies that were already ancient when you were born. The shield you carry might be nearly identical to the one your grandfather used, fighting different enemies in different lands, but facing the same fundamental challenges. As you stand in formation, feeling the weight of your spear, the drag of your shield, and the minimal reassurance of your quilted linen armor, one truth becomes unavoidable. Your equipment might determine whether you live or die, but it offers no guarantees. The finest bronze sword ever forged can't protect you from an arrow you don't see coming. The most carefully maintained shield provides no defense from behind. Your tools of war are just that, tools, imperfect and limited, extensions of your own imperfect and limited capacity to survive chaos. But these tools don't operate in isolation. They're components in a larger system, the tactical formations and battlefield strategies that Egypt has developed over centuries of warfare. Your individual equipment might be underwhelming, but combined with dozens or hundreds of similarly equipped men moving in coordination, it becomes part of something more effective than the sum of its parts. How these human and material components work together, that's the real Egyptian military technology, more sophisticated than any single bronze blade or linen armor piece. And it's into these formations that you'll march, carrying your ancient tools, facing enemies with their own ancient tools, participating in the brutal technology exchange program that humans call warfare. Equipment is only as effective as the system using it. A spear in the hands of an isolated individual is just a pointy stick. But that same spear, multiplied by hundreds and arranged in a coordinated formation, becomes part of a living machine designed for one purpose: methodical killing. Egyptian battle tactics weren't revolutionary or particularly flexible, but they were effective enough to build and maintain an empire. That's the system you're now a component in. Not a warrior, not a hero, just a necessary cog in Egypt's military mechanism. The fundamental Egyptian infantry formation is the phalanx, though not the later, more sophisticated Greek version. The Egyptian phalanx is simpler, densely packed ranks of shield-bearing spearmen, creating a mobile wall of death. You stand shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers, shields overlapping slightly, spears extended at roughly the same height. The front rank presents a bristling hedge of spear points, while the ranks behind provide weight, pressure, and ready replacements for when men in front inevitably fall. This formation isn't designed for individual glory. There are no opportunities for heroic one-on-one duels or dramatic personal victories. Your job is maintenance of position, coordination with the men beside you, and commitment to the collective action. The effectiveness of the phalanx depends entirely on its cohesion. One gap, one broken link, and the entire formation becomes vulnerable. You learn to fear breaking formation more than you fear the enemy, partly because your officers will punish formation breakers with enthusiastic brutality, but mostly because you've seen what happens to units when their formation collapses. It's never pretty, and it's often terminal. The basic phalanx evolved over Egypt's long military history. Old Kingdom formations were relatively unsophisticated, essentially armed mobs with minimal training and coordination. By the Middle Kingdom, true phalanx tactics emerged, with greater emphasis on training and discipline. The New Kingdom saw the most sophisticated developments, with specialized units, combined arms tactics, and the integration of chariot warfare into infantry operations. Throughout this evolution, however, the core principles remained the same: cohesion, discipline, and collective action over individual initiative. Your position in the formation determines both your function and your likelihood of survival. Front-rank soldiers face the highest immediate danger, but have better visibility and maneuverability. Middle ranks experience the bizarre discomfort of being simultaneously crushed from behind by your own forces, while facing the shield wall of your front rank, seeing little of the actual battle except when gaps appear, usually because someone in front of you has fallen. Rear ranks have the lowest immediate danger, but suffer the psychological strain of advancing toward combat, while watching casualties being dragged back through your position. The most feared enemy of any formation soldier isn't necessarily the opposing army, it's panic. Once panic takes hold, formations disintegrate, and disintegrated formations lead to slaughter. Egyptian military training focuses intensely on panic resistance, conditioning soldiers to maintain discipline even as chaos erupts around them. You're trained to trust the formation more than your individual survival instincts, which isn't natural and requires systematic psychological reconstruction. Some never fully adapt, breaking at the first sign of real danger. These unfortunates rarely survive their first battle, either killed by the enemy or, in some cases, by their own officers, making examples of them. Battlefield communication presents enormous challenges in ancient warfare. There are no radios, no field telephones, not even signal flags in most cases. Communication relies on simple drum patterns, horn blasts, and visual alignment with unit standards, tall poles bearing distinctive emblems representing your regiment or division. These standards aren't just symbolic, they're your navigation system in the swirling chaos of battle. Lose sight of your standard, and you've potentially lost your unit, your protection, and quite possibly your life. Orders flow down a crude chain of command, from generals to unit commanders, to squad leaders, to you. In the noise and confusion of battle, these orders often become garbled, misinterpreted, or simply impossible to hear. You learn to watch the men around you, to feel the pressure and movement of the formation, developing a kind of collective situational awareness that functions even when verbal commands fail. Veterans develop an almost supernatural ability to anticipate formation changes through subtle shifts in pressure or the positioning of nearby officers. Chariots transform Egyptian battlefield tactics during the New Kingdom, though not in the way popular imagination might suggest. Egyptian chariots aren't heavy assault vehicles like those depicted in modern films. They're light, fast platforms carrying a driver and a warrior armed with a bow or javelins. Their primary roles are reconnaissance, harassment, pursuit of broken enemies, and mobile firepower, not directly charging into infantry formations, which would be suicidal against disciplined spearmen. For infantry like you, chariot cooperation presents specific challenges. You must maintain formation while chariots maneuver around you, sometimes passing through gaps intentionally created in your lines. The dust clouds they generate can blind entire sections of the battlefield, and the noise of wheels and horses adds to the sensory chaos. Friendly chariots support you by disrupting enemy formations and providing mobile firepower, but they also expect you to create and maintain safe corridors for their operation and retreat. It's a complex dance between different military arms, often rehearsed extensively before campaigns, but rarely executing perfectly in the confusion of actual battle. Egyptian commanders typically employ a fairly predictable tactical sequence. Initial skirmishing with archers and slingers is followed by chariot operations to disrupt enemy formations. Once the enemy shows signs of disorder, the main infantry phalanx advances at a measured pace, seeking to engage the weakened sections of the opposing force. This methodical approach relies on discipline rather than speed or surprise. Egypt prefers to fight defensive battles when possible, using terrain and prepared positions to maximize their formation's effectiveness while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. The Egyptians excel at siege operations, though these test the endurance of regular troops. While specialized engineers handle the technical aspects of reducing enemy fortifications, common infantry like you provide security, labor, and eventual assault troops. Siege camps become semi-permanent installations with all the discomforts of military life amplified by duration. Disease spreads more readily, supplies grow scarcer, and morale deteriorates as days stretch into weeks or months. When the walls finally breach, you're expected to charge into the gap regardless of your deteriorated condition. Because siege operations are expensive and commanders want their investment to pay off quickly once an opportunity appears. River operations form another Egyptian specialty, leveraging the Nile and its tributaries for military transport and tactical advantage. Transport boats move troops and supplies far more efficiently than overland marching, while specialized warboats provide mobile platforms for archers. Amphibious operations, landing troops from boats to engage land-based enemies, require specialized training and coordination. These river tactics give Egyptian forces significant mobility advantages within their home territory and nearby regions, though their effectiveness diminishes with distance from navigable waterways. The psychological dimension of Egyptian tactics deserves special mention. Egypt understands the power of intimidation and spectacle in warfare. Before major engagements, formations perform synchronized movements and weapons displays designed to impress and intimidate. War cries, synchronized shield pounding, and the advance of perfect formations serve dual purposes, frightening enemies while reinforcing your own unit cohesion. Psychological operations extend to the treatment of prisoners, with public executions or mutilations of captured enemies serving as graphic demonstrations of the consequences of resistance. Battle is never clean or organized, despite the best tactical planning. The carefully aligned form. Defending Egypt's borders is one thing. Marching beyond them into foreign lands is something else entirely. A special category of misery that tests not just your combat skills, but your endurance, adaptability, and will to survive. The pharaoh's ambition doesn't stop at Egypt's natural boundaries, and neither does your service. Foreign campaigns are where Egypt's military machine truly reveals both its impressive capabilities and its catastrophic limitations, often simultaneously and at your direct expense. The announcement of a foreign campaign ripples through military camps, with a complex mix of dread and anticipation. Veterans exchange knowing looks, while new recruits boast excitedly, blissfully ignorant of what awaits them. You're given minimal information, a general destination, estimates of how long you'll be gone, and basic equipment requirements. The actual objectives, enemies, or challenges rarely filter down to your level. You're not expected to understand the campaign, just to march, fight, and possibly die for it. Preparation for foreign expeditions involves frantic activity. Weapons are inspected with unusual thoroughness. Supply officers suddenly appear, counting and calculating with worried expressions. Priests perform elaborate ceremonies, sacrificing to gods of travel, war, and foreign lands. You're issued additional equipment, water containers, spare sandals, basic medical supplies, along with stern warnings about making them last. The subtext is clear. Once you leave Egypt, resupply becomes uncertain. What you carry may be all you get. The journey begins with deceptive optimism. Units march out of garrisons with standards flying, drummers setting pace, and formations still crisp and orderly. Local civilians might line the routes, offering blessings or simply watching this display of Egyptian military might. For a brief moment, you might actually feel important, part of something powerful and purposeful. This illusion typically lasts until you're beyond populated areas, at which point the real journey begins, and with it, the real suffering. Egyptian campaigns radiate outward in several directions, each presenting unique challenges. Campaigns eastward into Canaan and Syria mean crossing the Sinai Desert, a blistering, waterless expanse where more soldiers fall to heat and dehydration than enemy action. Northward campaigns up the Mediterranean coast offer somewhat easier terrain, but require complex coordination with naval forces for supply. Southward expeditions into Nubia and beyond involve increasingly alien environments, disease-ridden river valleys, and hostile populations intimately familiar with the difficult terrain. The march itself becomes your primary enemy long before you encounter actual opposition. The Egyptian army moves at a pace of about 15 to 20 miles per day under ideal conditions, which rarely exist. The column stretches for miles. Infantry in formation blocks, supply carts, pack animals, chariot units in separate groups, and a small city of camp followers, craftsmen, cooks, servants, occasionally prostitutes, and inevitably swarms of opportunistic merchants. This enormous caravan moves like a wounded animal, slow, vulnerable, and leaving a trail anyone could follow. Logistics, the science of moving and supplying armies, exists in a primitive form, but it's stretched to breaking point during foreign campaigns. Egyptian military planners calculate water, food, and equipment needs with impressive detail, but their careful preparations inevitably collide with reality. Water sources described in past campaign records are found dry. Territories marked as fertile turn out to be barren due to drought or enemy scorched earth tactics. Supply caches established along expected routes are found looted or spoiled. Water becomes an obsession on the march. Your daily ration, typically about 2 liters in normal conditions, is often reduced as supplies dwindle. You learn to manage extreme thirst, to march with a dry mouth and cracked lips, to fantasize about drinking your fill while rationing sips from your increasingly precious water container. Veterans develop almost supernatural abilities to sense water sources, slight changes in vegetation, cloud patterns, even the behavior of local animals. Those who fail to develop these skills or manage their rations often don't return. Food follows a similar pattern of carefully planned inadequacy. Your standard marching ration consists of bread, dried fruit, and occasional dried meat or fish. The bread, which starts the journey merely unappetizing, achieves previously unimagined levels of inedibility as days pass, becoming rock hard, moldy, or both. You eat it anyway because the alternative is nothing. Supplementary foraging is encouraged when possible, though in unfamiliar territories, this leads to inevitable cases of poisoning from unknown plants or contaminated water sources. Disease spreads through the marching army with frightening efficiency. The combination of inadequate sanitation, unfamiliar water sources, insect-borne illnesses, and the reduced immunity of stressed, malnourished bodies creates perfect conditions for epidemics. Dysentery becomes so common it's barely remarked upon. You simply make your contribution to the trail of filth behind the army and continue marching. More serious outbreaks, fevers, pox, parasitic infections, can devastate entire units before they ever face an enemy. Sleep on campaign becomes a rare luxury. Marching days start before dawn and often continue until dusk. Upon halting, you're immediately assigned camp duties: digging defensive trenches, erecting temporary fortifications, setting up tents for officers, or foraging for supplies. By the time these tasks are complete, you might have 2 or 3 hours for actual rest before dawn brings the next march. The chronic sleep deprivation accumulates, leading to hallucinations, microsleeps while actually marching, and a persistent fog of exhaustion that clouds judgment and slows reactions, not ideal conditions for eventual combat. Weather becomes an enemy of surprising ferocity. The Egyptian military, conditioned for the relatively predictable climate of the Nile Valley, struggles with the extreme variations found in foreign lands. Desert campaigns bring scorching days and frigid nights, with temperature swings that crack equipment and test human endurance. Mountain expeditions encounter unexpected snowfalls or sudden storms. Coastal routes bring drenching rains that turn camps into swamps and roads into impassable mud pits. The gods of foreign lands seem determined to demonstrate their displeasure at Egyptian intrusion through increasingly creative meteorological torments. The psychological impact of being far from home cannot be overstated. Egypt isn't just a place, it's a cosmological center, the ordered realm of Ma'at, surrounded by chaotic foreign lands. Moving beyond Egypt's borders means entering spaces where different gods hold power, where familiar protections weaken, where the very landscape seems designed to reject Egyptian presence. Religious anxiety compounds the physical hardships, with soldiers performing increasingly desperate rituals to maintain connection with Egyptian deities who seem increasingly distant. For most campaigns, your march takes you through territories with past experience of Egyptian armies, meaning the locals have usually evacuated, taking anything useful with them. Villages stand empty, wells filled with stones or fouled with animal carcasses, fields harvested or burned. The army's size prevents stealth. Your approach is announced days in advance by dust clouds, fleeing wildlife, and the inevitable scouts and spies monitoring your progress. By the time you arrive anywhere worth conquering, the enemy is thoroughly prepared for your coming. Unfamiliar terrain presents tactical challenges that Egyptian military doctrine struggles to address. Formations designed for open desert or river valleys prove difficult to maintain in mountainous regions, dense forests, or swampy lowlands. Egyptian commanders typically respond with stubborn adherence to standard tactics rather than adaptation, leading to situations where units maintain technically perfect formations that are perfectly inappropriate for the actual battlefield conditions. The farther you march from Egypt, the more alien the world becomes. Different languages, customs, architecture, and weaponry create a sense of disorientation. Egyptian cultural superiority, drilled into you since childhood, collides with the reality of sophisticated foreign civilizations with their own ancient histories and technological innovations. Some of these cultures have been dealing with Egyptian invasions for generations and have developed specific counter-tactics for Egyptian military approaches. The psychological advantage of representing the world's greatest empire diminishes with each mile from the Nile. Communication with Egypt essentially ceases once you're beyond a certain distance. Military messengers maintain tenuous contact with command centers, but ordinary soldiers receive no news from home, no letters, no updates on family or domestic events. Your world shrinks to the immediate surroundings, your unit, your daily march, your diminishing supplies. In this isolation, rumors spread with virus-like efficiency. Tales of disasters befalling other units, mythical beasts inhabiting the next region, or divine omens prophesying doom circulate in whispers during rest periods. Officers combat these with harsh punishment for spreading fear, but can never quite eliminate the shadow network of terrified speculation. Campaign durations vary wildly depending on objectives and complications. Minor punitive expeditions against border tribes might last weeks. Major campaigns into Syria or Nubia could stretch for years. The uncertainty adds another layer of psychological strain. You never know if this journey away from Egypt will last a season or the rest of your life. Long campaigns often involve establishing semi-permanent bases in conquered territories. creating strange hybrid communities where Egyptian military structure attempts to function in utterly foreign contexts. For all these hardships, foreign campaigns do offer rare opportunities. Plunder, officially sanctioned and organized, provides the possibility of returning with wealth unattainable through normal military service. Officers supervise the collection of valuable goods from conquered territories: precious metals, exotic woods, rare stones, specialized crafts, with portions designated for common soldiers. In practice, the distribution typically favors higher ranks, with ordinary infantry receiving symbolic tokens rather than significant treasure. Still, the possibility of returning wealthy enough to improve your family's status provides powerful motivation to survive the campaign's countless hazards. The actual encounters with enemy forces, when they finally occur, often prove anticlimactic after the grueling journey. Many potential opponents choose harassment and withdrawal over direct confrontation, recognizing that Egypt's massive army is weakened by its own supply challenges and unfamiliarity with local conditions. Raids on your supply lines, ambushes of isolated units, night attacks on camps, and contamination of water sources wear down Egyptian forces more effectively than pitched battles. When major engagements do occur, they're frequently in locations chosen by the defenders specifically to neutralize Egyptian tactical advantages. Famous battles recorded in temple inscriptions, Kadesh, Megiddo, the Nubian campaigns, take on very different character in the experience of ordinary soldiers compared to official accounts. The Battle of Kadesh, celebrated in massive propaganda displays as a great victory under Ramesses II, was actually a near-catastrophic ambush that Egyptian forces barely survived. The monumental inscriptions don't mention the terror of being surrounded by Hittite chariots, the collapse of entire divisions, or the desperate retreat that preceded the supposed victory. You learn quickly that surviving a campaign means understanding the difference between what happened and what will be carved on temple walls afterward. The journey home, for those fortunate enough to experience it, brings its own unique miseries. The triumphant return depicted in official art, orderly columns of soldiers leading captured enemies and exotic treasures, bears little resemblance to the reality of exhausted, disease-riddled units staggering back toward Egyptian borders. The army that returns is invariably smaller than the one that departed, diminished by combat, disease, desertion, and the countless small tragedies that unfold far from recording scribes. Those who do make it back bring more than physical spoils. Foreign campaigns expose Egyptian soldiers to different technologies, tactics, and cultural practices. Despite official disdain for foreign ways, practical innovations are quietly adopted. New weapon designs, unfamiliar agricultural techniques, exotic religious concepts, all filter back into Egypt through returning soldiers, creating subtle cultural exchange despite the campaign's ostensibly imperialistic purpose. For many, the most significant impact isn't what they bring back, but what they've left behind. Foreign campaigns create diaspora communities through desertion, capture, or intentional settlement. Some soldiers, facing the prospect of another grueling march or seeing opportunity in conquered territories, simply vanish into local populations. Others remain as garrison forces in established outposts, eventually intermarrying with local women and creating mixed communities with unique cultural characteristics. The Egyptian empire expands not just through conquest, but through these unplanned human dispersions. As you finally cross back into Egyptian territory, seeing familiar landscapes and hearing familiar languages, the reality of your experience crystallizes. You've survived what many didn't. You've seen worlds beyond the Nile that most Egyptians cannot imagine. You've been broken down and remade by hardships that temple carvings will never depict. The foreign campaign has changed you in ways that make full reintegration into Egyptian society challenging, a truth understood only by fellow veterans who share knowing glances in the markets and taverns of your homeland. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of foreign campaigns is their cyclical nature. Egypt's imperial ambitions are never fully satisfied. Territories conquered must be maintained, rebellions must be suppressed, resources must be extracted. This means that surviving one campaign doesn't exempt you from future expeditions. Many veterans find themselves marching outward again, just as they've begun to recover from previous journeys, heading back into the unknown with the added burden of knowing exactly what awaits them. And even more than the march, more than the alien landscapes and peoples, more than the logistical nightmares and psychological strain, what truly defines the foreign campaign experience is its culmination, the moment when all the suffering and sacrifice leads to actual combat, when the weakened, exhausted Egyptian army finally confronts the enemy it has marched so far to engage. This is where theory meets reality, where formation training meets chaos, where your individual capacity for violence and survival is truly tested. After weeks or months of marching, after the gradual erosion of your strength through hunger, thirst, and disease, after becoming intimately acquainted with every form of discomfort the ancient world can devise, you finally encounter what you've been trained for: actual combat. This is the moment temple carvings depict in heroic, sanitized imagery. The reality bears no resemblance to those tidy, artistic representations. Battle in the Bronze Age isn't glorious. It's a multi-sensory nightmare that your mind will spend the rest of your life trying to forget, assuming you survive at all. The approach to battle has its own distinct rhythm. Scouts return with confirmed enemy positions. Officers gather for hasty planning. Priests perform last-minute divinations and sacrifices, searching for favorable omens. Units receive positioning orders, moving into preliminary formations while still beyond enemy sight. The army transforms from a marching column into a battle array, a process that takes hours and generates confused shouting, contradictory orders, and the distinct impression that no one quite knows what they're doing, despite their confident expressions. During these preparations, your bodily reactions betray the fear you're not permitted to express. Your stomach churns, either empty from rationing or rebelliously rejecting what little food you've managed to consume. Your mouth dries despite adequate hydration. Your hands tremble slightly, making weapon adjustments more difficult. Some men empty their bowels repeatedly. Others can't urinate despite full bladders. Veterans recognize these symptoms without comment. They're experiencing the same reactions, just with less visible intensity. The body knows what's coming, even if the mind refuses to fully acknowledge it. The waiting is its own special torment. Formations complete, you stand in position, sometimes for hours. As final preparations continue, the sun beats down. Your armor becomes an oven. The weight of your shield, manageable during morning drills, grows increasingly unbearable. Legs cramp, backs ache. Insects bite exposed skin with impunity because swatting them would break formation discipline. Through it all, you're denied the release of movement, trapped in a purgatory of anticipation, while imagining countless gruesome possibilities for your immediate future. First visual contact with the enemy rarely provides clarity. At distance, opposing forces appear as vague masses, indistinct shapes on the landscape. You strain to discern details, numbers, weapons, formations, but can make out little beyond general impressions. Officers with better vantage points might have clearer views, but their knowledge seldom filters down to your level. You're left with uncertainty and the growing realization that those distant shapes contain humans actively planning to kill you within the hour. The audio dimension of approaching battle arrives before visual clarity. War cries, drum beats, the metallic symphony of weapons being readied. These sounds carry across battlefields with unsettling effectiveness. Egyptian forces have their own sonic repertoire, synchronized chants invoking Montu or Sekhmet, rhythmic shield pounding, battle hymns that sound far more confident than the men singing them actually feel. These performances serve dual purposes, intimidating enemies while temporarily distracting you from your own terror. Movement begins with agonizing slowness. Forward advance in formation requires careful coordination, especially over uneven ground. You take short, measured steps, maintaining alignment with adjacent soldiers. Too fast risks opening gaps in the formation. Too slow risks losing momentum. the instinct to rush forward and get the inevitable over with battles against training that demands measured pace. Officers walk behind the ranks, ensuring proper intervals and swiftly correcting deviations with shouted commands or physical adjustments involving the blunt end of a spear. As the distance closes, sensory impressions intensify. You begin to make out individual enemies, their weapons, their armor or lack thereof, their apparent readiness. Variations in equipment suggest different tribal groups or military specializations. Standards and insignia might identify specific enemies known from previous encounters or intelligence reports. Experienced soldiers mutter assessments of the opposing force, noting vulnerabilities, unusual deployments, or recognized unit identifiers that might predict enemy tactics. At around 200 yards, missile exchanges typically begin. Archers from both sides loose initial volleys, creating brief, deadly rain. These long-range attacks are more psychological than tactically decisive. The accuracy at such distances is poor, and most arrows are stopped by shields. Nevertheless, men fall. Screams pierce the rhythmic sounds of advance. Gaps appear in the formation, quickly filled by soldiers from rear ranks as trained. Your shield feels absurdly inadequate as protection against the invisible death flying overhead. But you raise it anyway, peering nervously from beneath its edge while maintaining forward movement. The smell reaches you next. An unexpected assault on senses already overwhelmed. Large groups of unwashed, frightened humans generate powerful odors, detectable well before physical contact. Both armies bring their distinct olfactory signatures to this unwilling exchange. Different diets, different oils, different materials in their equipment, all contributing to the bouquet. Veterans claim they can identify specific enemy groups by smell alone. Whether this is true or simply hardened soldiers' bravado is irrelevant. The point is that battle engages all senses, including those rarely mentioned in heroic accounts. At closer range, slingers and javelin throwers contribute their more accurate missiles. These shorter-range weapons find gaps in shield coverage with disturbing regularity. Men who survive the arrow volleys fall to sling stones that crack skulls or javelins that punch through inadequate armor. The formation continues to move forward, stepping over or around fallen comrades with practiced indifference. There's no time for aid or acknowledgement. The relentless momentum of advance permits no compassion. You try not to look down, not to register the faces of men you've lived alongside for months or years, now transformed into obstacles to be navigated. The final approach breaks the last barriers between anticipation and reality. You can now clearly see enemy faces, their expressions, their shouted words, incomprehensible in their foreign tongues but unmistakable in intent. The individual characteristics that transform them from abstract threats to specific humans intending to kill you personally. Some smile with unsettling eagerness. Others show fear that mirrors your own. Most wear the blank mask of men forcing themselves forward against every natural instinct of self-preservation. Impact, the moment formations collide, defies coherent description. The relatively orderly advance dissolves into chaotic violence with shocking abruptness. The front ranks meet in a crash of shields, a cacophony of impact sounds, and immediate, desperate close-quarter fighting. If you're in those initial contact ranks, your world narrows to the few square feet directly before you. Your training takes over as conscious thought becomes impossible. Shield positioned, spear thrusting at vulnerable points, constant pressure forward to maintain formation integrity. The physics of battle creates crushing pressure within formations. Rear ranks push forward, compressing men against the enemy line. This pressure can become so intense that fallen soldiers remain standing, held upright by the press of bodies around them. You find yourself simultaneously trying to fight effectively, breathe in the compressed space, and avoid being trampled if you lose footing. The formation becomes an organism with its own momentum, carrying individual soldiers along regardless of their intentions or conditions. Bronze weaponry creates distinctive wounds, unlike those inflicted by later iron or steel. Bronze is softer, meaning weapons deform more easily on impact. Spear points bend, Sword edges dull quickly, axe heads loosen from their hafts. This doesn't make them less deadly, just less predictable and often more traumatic in their effects. A bronze sword might not deliver the clean cut depicted in temple reliefs. Instead, it tears and rips flesh in jagged patterns that cause massive bleeding and terrible pain. Bronze spearheads sometimes break off in wounds, remaining embedded as the shaft is withdrawn, creating injuries nearly impossible to treat effectively with ancient medical knowledge. The sounds of active combat bear no resemblance to the disciplined war cries of the approach. Instead, there's a horrific symphony of metal on metal, metal on flesh, splintering wood, and human vocalizations spanning the entire spectrum of possible sounds. Screams, grunts, pleas, curses, prayers, incoherent animal noises emerging from human throats. The overall effect is disorienting, making it nearly impossible to hear commands or coordinate beyond the most basic visual cues. Blood transforms the battlefield with surprising speed. It sprays in arterial jets, pools beneath fallen combatants, soaks into the ground, creating slippery mud that complicates footing. The metallic smell becomes overwhelming, triggering deep instinctual responses, revulsion and fear in some, unsettling excitement in others. Your equipment becomes progressively spattered, regardless of whether you've personally struck anyone. By battle's end, surviving soldiers are often indistinguishable in their crimson coating, Egyptian and enemy alike. Time perception alters dramatically during combat. What temple inscriptions might describe as a swift, decisive engagement actually unfolds as an excruciating eternity for participants. Brief moments of intense action alternate with periods of stalemate, where opposing formations press against each other in a gruesome shoving match punctuated by opportunistic strikes at exposed areas. A battle lasting 2 hours, relatively brief by ancient standards, feels like days to those experiencing it, each minute stretched by adrenaline and terror into subjective hours. Visibility deteriorates as battle progresses. Dust kicked up by thousands of feet creates a low-hanging cloud over the battlefield. Sweat and blood run into your eyes, blurring vision. The chaotic movement makes it increasingly difficult to distinguish friend from foe beyond your immediate vicinity. In this confusion, friendly casualties from misidentification become common, a horror that military records conveniently omit but survivors remember with particular guilt. Fatigue becomes a deadlier enemy than opposing soldiers as combat extends. The extraordinary energy expenditure of fighting in formation while wearing equipment quickly depletes physical reserves already compromised by the campaign's hardships. Arms grow leaden, reactions slow, technique deteriorates. Veterans pace themselves, conserving energy with efficient movements, while novices exhaust themselves in frantic, adrenaline-fueled effort during the battle's early phases. This fatigue differential often determines who survives and who falls as combat progresses. Cohesion, the maintenance of formation integrity, typically determines outcomes more than individual fighting prowess. Egyptian tactics rely on collective action rather than heroic individual efforts. As long as the formation holds, it provides mutual protection and coordinated offensive capability. When formations fragment, however, the battle devolves into smaller group actions and eventually individual combat, scenarios where Egyptian training proves less advantageous against enemies more accustomed to personal combat skills. The psychological breaking point varies between individuals and units. Some formations collapse after minimal casualties, a chain reaction of panic spreading through their ranks. Others maintain discipline despite horrific losses, fighting effectively until physically overwhelmed. This unpredictable human element frustrates commanders' calculations and explains why seemingly evenly matched forces can experience drastically different outcomes. You witness both courage and cowardice in unexpected sources. The boastful trainee who flees at first blood, the quiet, unassuming soldier who stands his ground against impossible odds. Death in ancient combat comes in countless variations, few resembling the noble, instant fatalities depicted in art. Many wounded die slowly, bleeding out from injuries that modern medicine would easily treat. Others suffer traumatic internal damage from blunt impacts that leave few external marks but cause agonizing, lingering deaths. Some are trampled underfoot in the chaos, their ends ignoble and unmarked by any heroic last stand. The most fortunate experience the rare quick death from precise strikes to vital areas, but these are the exception rather than the rule. If your formation holds while the enemy's breaks, you experience the transition from defensive fighting to pursuit, a dangerous phase where discipline often collapses. The temptation to chase fleeing enemies, to release accumulated tension in unrestricted aggression, overwhelms training for many soldiers. Officers struggle to maintain control, knowing that disorganized pursuit leaves forces vulnerable to counterattack or ambush. You're ordered to maintain formation even in victory, to advance methodically rather than rush forward individually, one of the hardest commands to obey after surviving the nightmare of close combat. Battlefield aftermath presents images that will haunt survivors' dreams for decades. The ground becomes a tableau of human destruction in all its variations. Bodies in impossible postures, internal organs exposed to open air, faces frozen in final expressions of pain or surprise. The twitching of not quite dead men too far gone for aid. These sights burn themselves into memory with permanent clarity. The smells intensify as bodies begin decomposition in the heat. Flies arrive with disgusting promptness, beginning their work while the wounded are still being collected. For survivors, the post-battle period brings its own distinct trauma. The artificial intensity of combat, the heightened awareness, the suppression of normal emotional responses, the complete focus on immediate survival, doesn't dissipate cleanly. You're left in a disoriented state, simultaneously exhausted yet unable to rest, hungry yet nauseated by the thought of food, desperate for human connection yet unable to communicate the experience to anyone who wasn't there. Modern terminology would identify this as acute stress reaction. Ancient Egyptians simply accepted it as the natural aftermath of battle, treating it with beer, sleep, and ritual purification rather than psychological intervention. Victory or defeat shapes the immediate post-battle experience practically, if not emotionally. Victory means tending your wounded while collecting enemy weapons and valuable equipment. It means hasty fortification against possible counterattack. It means burial details for fallen comrades and mass graves, or corpse exposure for enemies. Defeat, if you survive it, means desperate retreat, abandoned wounded, their fates better not contemplated, and reorganization if possible, or complete rout if not. Either outcome leaves you fundamentally changed. The reality of ancient combat, once experienced, permanently alters your relationship with existence. The fragility of human life, demonstrated in hundreds of variations across the battlefield, becomes impossible to unsee. You develop a peculiar fatalism common to combat veterans across history. Not quite surrender to inevitability, but a restructured understanding of mortality that separates you from those who haven't faced these realities directly. But survival brings its own immediate concerns. Many emerge from battle with injuries requiring attention, and the Egyptian military's capacity to address these wounds will determine whether your survival extends beyond the immediate aftermath. The quality of medical care, primitive by modern standards but sophisticated for its era, becomes your next critical encounter in the ongoing struggle to return home from Egypt's foreign wars. Surviving the immediate chaos of battle doesn't guarantee your survival of the campaign. The aftermath brings its own deadly trials, particularly for the wounded. Egyptian military medicine exists in that uncomfortable space between surprisingly sophisticated knowledge and horrifyingly primitive practice. It might save you, or it might finish what the enemy began, with roughly equal probability regardless of the wound's initial severity. The medical response begins during battle, but intensifies immediately after combat ends. Field medics, typically priests with specialized training or experienced soldiers with practical knowledge, move through the battlefield, performing rapid assessments. Their triage process is brutally pragmatic. The mortally wounded receive brief comfort measures at best. The walking wounded get basic field dressings, and those with serious but potentially survivable injuries are gathered for more extensive treatment. Resources are limited, and harsh calculations determine who receives care and who doesn't. Egyptian understanding of anatomy is surprisingly advanced, thanks to mummification practices that provided extensive knowledge of human internal structures. Military physicians can identify major blood vessels, understand the criticality of certain organs, and recognize the significance of specific injury locations. This knowledge shapes their treatment priorities, controlling hemorrhage first, then addressing contamination, then managing pain. What they lack isn't anatomical understanding but effective treatments, sterile conditions, and pain management options. Battlefield treatment facilities bear little resemblance to modern field hospitals. They're typically designated areas near the camp, sometimes with basic shelter structures, but often just clearings where the wounded are gathered. Equipment consists of linen bandages, basic surgical tools, knives, probes, needles, herbal preparations, and sometimes specialized splints or braces. The overwhelming smell combines blood, bodily wastes, herbal remedies, and the early stages of infection. Screams and moans provide constant background noise as treatments proceed without effective anesthesia. Wound cleaning represents the first and most critical intervention. Egyptian physicians understand that foreign material in wounds promotes infection, though they attribute this to spiritual contamination rather than microorganisms. They use wine, honey, or natron solution, a natural salt compound used in mummification, to clean wounds, choices that coincidentally provide some genuine antimicrobial benefit. The pain of this cleaning process is excruciating. You've seen strong men lose consciousness during wound irrigation, a mercy considering the alternatives. Bleeding control relies on direct pressure, cauterization, or binding agents. For surface wounds, physicians apply pressure bandages made from linen, sometimes infused with herbs believed to promote clotting. Deeper arterial bleeding might receive cauterization, the application of heated metal instruments to burn and seal vessels. This procedure saves lives, but creates additional trauma and increases infection risk. For wounds where neither pressure nor cauterization is feasible, they apply various compounds, including copper salts, moldy bread containing primitive antibiotics, or animal dung, which despite its apparent filthiness, sometimes contains helpful antibacterial substances. Suturing exists, but remains relatively rare in battlefield medicine. Egyptian physicians prefer wound bandaging over stitching for most injuries, believing that allowing wounds to drain prevents corruption, a concept not entirely wrong. When they do suture, they use linen thread and curved needles, creating rough closures that prioritize functional healing over cosmetic results. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, sutured wounds frequently develop infections, leading to the common practice of reopening and cleaning them repeatedly during the healing process. Fracture treatment demonstrates some of Egyptian medicine's most sophisticated techniques. Physicians can recognize different types of bone breaks and apply appropriate stabilization. Simple fractures receive splinting with wood, reed, or palm ribs wrapped in linen. Compound fractures, where bone penetrates skin, undergo wound cleaning before splinting, with varying degrees of success. Some military medical texts describe surprisingly modern-sounding reduction techniques for dislocations, including specific manipulations for different joints. Pain management relies on a combination of herbal preparations and psychological approaches. Opium, derived from Egyptian-grown poppies, provides the most effective pain relief, but remains reserved for the most severe cases due to limited supply. More commonly, physicians administer beer or wine with various herbs, mandrake root, cannabis, nightshade, creating sedative mixtures of unpredictable potency. For minor procedures, they employ pressure techniques on nerve points or simple distraction methods. Many wounded soldiers receive no effective pain relief at all, experiencing treatments with full, agonizing awareness. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, but likely based on much older material, provides insight into Egyptian battlefield medicine. This remarkable document describes 48 trauma cases, many clearly related to combat injuries. For each case, it provides assessment methods, prognosis categorization, treatable, contestable, or untreatable, and specific interventions. The systematic approach demonstrates a surprisingly scientific methodology centuries before Hippocrates. However, the text also reveals the limitations of ancient treatment. Many serious injuries receive the simple verdict, an ailment not to be treated, indicating recognition of cases beyond their capabilities. Amputation represents the most dreaded, yet sometimes necessary battlefield procedure. Egyptian physicians understand that crushed limbs, severe compound fractures, or gangrenous infections require limb removal for survival. The procedure is performed with brutal efficiency. Copper or bronze saws cut through bone, while assistants restrain the patient. Bleeding control involves cauterization or tourniquet application, followed by bandaging with honey, wine, or other antiseptic substances. Survival rates are predictably low, with infection or shock claiming most amputation patients despite physicians' best efforts. Cranial injuries receive special attention in Egyptian medical texts, reflecting their frequency in combat and their obviously critical nature. The Edwin Smith Papyrus dedicates significant space to head trauma, describing assessment techniques including pupil examination, speech evaluation, and motor function testing. Assessment components still used in modern medicine. Treatments for skull fractures include elevation of depressed fragments when possible and wound cleaning to prevent infection. Trepanation, the creation of holes in the skull to relieve pressure, appears in some Egyptian remains, though less frequently than in other ancient cultures. Infection represents the greatest threat to wounded soldiers who survive the initial injury. Without understanding of germ theory, Egyptian physicians attribute wound corruption to spiritual causes or imbalanced bodily elements. They recognize the signs of infection, redness, swelling, heat, purulent drainage, and attempt interventions, including wound reopening, drainage, and application of various substances. Some of these, like honey or moldy bread, coincidentally contain antimicrobial properties. Most, however, do little to address the underlying infection, leaving the patient's survival dependent on natural immune response. Post-treatment care varies dramatically based on the campaign situation and the wounded soldier's status. Officers and elite troops might be transported back to Egyptian territory for extended recovery in temple healing centers. Common infantry typically receive minimal ongoing care within campaign camps, expected to either recover sufficiently to resume duties or suffer the consequences. During retreats or rapid advances, wounded soldiers face abandonment risk, left behind with token supplies and slim survival chances. In the brutal calculus of ancient warfare, a soldier who cannot march or fight quickly becomes a liability rather than an asset. The psychological component of injury receives no formal recognition, but significant practical acknowledgement. Egyptian physicians understand that wounded soldiers need encouragement, distraction, and motivation to survive. They employ religious rituals, protective amulets, and regular prognosis discussions as part of treatment. These approaches address the spiritual aspects of injury in Egyptian cosmology, while coincidentally providing psychological support that improves recovery outcomes. Wounded soldiers, surrounded by comrades, offering encouragement, demonstrably survive at higher rates than isolated cases. A fact Egyptian medical practitioners observe without understanding the underlying mechanisms. Recovery timelines reflect both the severity of initial injuries and the effectiveness of treatment. Minor wounds, those not penetrating major vessels, organs, or joints, might heal sufficiently for return to limited duty within weeks. Moderate injuries involving deeper structures but without significant contamination typically require months of recovery with permanent functional impairment. Severe wounds that somehow don't prove immediately fatal often result in chronic disability, with survival itself considered the successful outcome rather than return to combat capability. For those who survive serious wounds, disability becomes a permanent reality. Egyptian society makes limited accommodation for disabled veterans. Those from higher social classes might receive ceremonial or administrative positions within the military or religious establishments. Common soldiers typically return to civilian life with whatever support their families can provide, often becoming dependent on relatives or reduced to begging if their injuries prevent return to agricultural or craft work. Some temple complexes offer limited charitable support for disabled veterans, though typically with religious service expectations in exchange. The visible and invisible scars of combat merge into a comprehensive identity transformation. Your body carries the evidence of survival: shortened limbs, restricted movement, distinctive scarring, chronic pain. These physical changes combine with the psychological impact of combat experience, creating a veteran identity recognized across Egyptian society. Some view these marks with respect, acknowledging sacrifice for Egypt's security and expansion. Others see only limitation, treating disabled veterans with pity or avoidance. Your experience falls somewhere between these extremes, depending on your specific injuries, social status, and available support systems. Medical knowledge transmission occurs primarily through apprenticeship rather than formal documentation. While texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus preserve specific techniques, most battlefield medicine relies on direct observation and practice under experienced physicians. This system perpetuates both the sophisticated anatomical knowledge and the ritualistic elements that characterize Egyptian medicine. Physicians serving with military units typically train specifically for trauma management, developing specialized skills distinct from temple healers, more focused on disease treatment or religious aspects of healing. The long-term outlook for seriously wounded soldiers is objectively grim by modern standards. Infection claims many who survive the initial injury. Those who overcome infection often face chronic disability, pain, and reduced quality of life. Without effective rehabilitation protocols, physical function rarely returns to pre-injury levels. Without psychological support systems, combat trauma and disability adjustment occur haphazardly, with high rates of despair, substance abuse, and suicide among seriously wounded veterans. Yet for all these limitations, Egyptian battlefield medicine represents a remarkable achievement for its era. The systematic approach to assessment, triage, and treatment demonstrates genuine empirical methodology. The anatomical knowledge informing treatment decisions shows sophisticated observational science. The combination of practical techniques with spiritual support acknowledges both physical and psychological dimensions of recovery. Within the constraints of Bronze Age technology and pre-scientific understanding, Egyptian physicians achieve outcomes that, while abysmal by modern standards, exceed what might reasonably be expected from their available resources. But physical wounds, however severe, represent only part of the battle's lasting impact. The invisible injuries, the psychological trauma of combat experience, often prove more persistently debilitating than physical damage. These wounds leave no visible scars, but reshape your mind and spirit in ways that Egyptian medicine, for all its relative sophistication, has no framework to understand or address. Physical wounds at least have the dignity of visibility. They're acknowledged, treated, however primitively, and recognized as legitimate suffering. But the deeper wounds, the ones that alter your mind rather than your body, receive no such consideration in ancient Egypt. These injuries leave no visible scars, but reshape your entire experience of existence. Modern terminology would identify combat-induced psychological trauma as PTSD, moral injury, or acute stress disorder. Ancient Egyptians had different frameworks for understanding these conditions, none of which fully captured their nature or offered effective treatment. The psychological impact of combat begins with the first battlefield experience, but accumulates with each subsequent engagement. Your first battle creates a fundamental break in your personal timeline, a clear division between the person you were before witnessing industrial-scale human destruction and the person you became afterward. Veterans recognize this transformation in each other instantly. It shows in the eyes, in subtle changes to movement patterns, in reflexive responses to sudden noises or movements. You're marked by experience as surely as if physically branded, though the marks remain invisible to those without similar experiences. Sleep becomes your first and most persistent battleground after combat. Nightmares plague nearly all veterans. Vivid, detailed recreations of battlefield horrors that jolt you awake, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, sometimes screaming, or physically fighting imaginary enemies. These aren't simple bad dreams. They're the mind's attempt to process experiences too extreme for normal integration. Some soldiers develop sleep avoidance, staying awake until absolute exhaustion forces brief, troubled unconsciousness. Others seek chemical assistance through alcohol or available drugs, creating additional problems while only temporarily masking the underlying condition. Flashbacks represent an even more disturbing manifestation of combat trauma. Without warning, your mind suddenly returns to battle, not just remembering but re-experiencing the sights, sounds, smells, and physical sensations. These episodes can be triggered by predictable stimuli, loud noises, certain smells, visual similarities to combat situations, or appear seemingly unprovoked. During these moments, your body responds as if genuinely threatened, activating fight or flight responses inappropriate to your actual surroundings. Egyptian soldiers experiencing flashbacks in public were often mistaken for being possessed by malevolent spirits or suffering divine punishment, adding social stigma to their psychological burden. Egyptian religious frameworks provided the primary context for understanding these symptoms. Soldiers displaying psychological trauma might be described as haunted by the unquiet spirits of enemies they'd killed, or comrades who died nearby. Others were considered afflicted by foreign deities taking revenge for battles fought in their territories. Some were believed to be suffering divine punishment for battlefield transgressions or ritual impurity. These explanations offered a comprehensible narrative structure, but led to problematic treatment approaches focused on spiritual rather than psychological interventions. The most common treatment involved purification rituals designed to remove spiritual contamination. Priests would perform elaborate ceremonies involving water purification, incense burning, specific incantations, and sometimes animal sacrifice. These rituals provided structured acknowledgement of suffering and community support, potentially offering some genuine psychological benefit despite their misguided theoretical basis. However, they did nothing to address the underlying neurobiological and psychological mechanisms of trauma, leaving fundamental issues unresolved regardless of temporary comfort. Amulets and protective charms represented another common response to psychological symptoms. Soldiers experiencing combat trauma might wear specific protective symbols meant to ward off hostile spirits or strengthen their connection to protective deities. These physical objects provided a sense of agency and protection that offered limited psychological comfort. The Egyptian belief that material objects could carry spiritual power created a thriving market in protective devices specifically marketed to veterans experiencing psychological difficulties, an ancient version of the modern snake oil industry targeting vulnerable trauma survivors. Self-medication through alcohol becomes the most widespread coping mechanism. Beer holds an established place in Egyptian culture, available to all social classes and incorporated into religious and social rituals. For traumatized veterans, however, it transforms from social lubricant to psychological analgesic. Egyptian beer contains lower alcohol content than modern varieties, requiring greater consumption for significant effect, leading to the characteristic heavy drinking pattern of troubled veterans. Military authorities recognize this behavior pattern, but generally tolerate it unless it interferes with duty performance, considering it an expected aspect of veteran psychology rather than a medical issue requiring intervention. Social isolation progressively separates traumatized veterans from civilian society. The combination of hypervigilance, emotional numbness, irritability, and sleep disturbance makes normal social interaction increasingly difficult. You find yourself unable to relate to civilians who haven't shared your experiences, frustrated by their trivial concerns and naive worldviews. Simultaneously, your behavior becomes increasingly disturbing to them. Your startle responses, emotional outbursts, or dissociative episodes marking you as dangerous or unstable. This mutual alienation pushes many veterans toward the margins of society, seeking company only among others who understand without explanation. Family relationships suffer particular strain from combat trauma. Returning veterans struggle to reconnect with spouses, children, and parents. Emotional numbness prevents normal, affectionate exchange. Hypervigilance creates tension in previously relaxed domestic environments. Sleep disturbances affect entire households. Irritability and anger outbursts damage trust and intimacy. Without conceptual framework for understanding these changes, families often attribute them to character deterioration or spiritual affliction, rather than recognizing them as symptoms of psychological injury. Many combat veterans lose their families entirely, driving them further into isolation and exacerbating their psychological deterioration. The psychological impact extends beyond obvious trauma symptoms into fundamental identity disruption. Combat experience forces confrontation with human capacity for violence, both in enemies and in yourself. The discovery that you can kill, that you might even experience satisfaction in effective violence, creates profound dissonance with pre-military self-conception and cultural ethical frameworks. Egyptian religious teaching emphasizes Ma'at, cosmic order, balance, and justice, yet battlefield experience reveals chaos, cruelty, and arbitrary suffering. Reconciling these contradictions requires either compartmentalization or comprehensive worldview reconstruction, neither process occurring easily or without psychological cost. Moral injury, the trauma resulting from participating in or witnessing actions that violate core ethical beliefs, affects many veterans independently of fear-based trauma. Egyptian soldiers participate in actions considered necessary for military objectives, but fundamentally contrary to civilian ethical standards. The execution of prisoners, destruction of civilian communities, enslavement of captured populations, and other wartime actions create lasting psychological damage even when performed under orders and with official religious sanction. These experiences generate profound shame, guilt, and spiritual distress that traditional purification rituals cannot adequately address. Survivor guilt emerges as a particularly corrosive form of moral injury. You live while comrades died, often through nothing more than arbitrary chance, standing slightly left instead of right when arrows fell, being assigned rear formation instead of front rank, or simply bending down at the precise moment a sword swung overhead. The mathematical randomness of survival contradicts Egyptian cosmological assumptions about divine order and justice. Living when equally or more worthy men died creates a persistent sense of wrongness that contaminates the very fact of continued existence. Some survivors unconsciously seek punishment or death to resolve this internal dissonance, engaging in progressively more dangerous behaviors until probability finally corrects the perceived cosmic error. For career soldiers experiencing multiple campaigns, psychological symptoms typically follow one of several trajectories. Some develop progressively worsening symptoms with each exposure, eventually becoming completely disabled by their trauma responses. Others achieve a kind of functional adaptation, never healing but developing sufficient coping mechanisms to continue military service despite persistent symptoms. A smaller group appears to develop psychological callousing, becoming increasingly detached and emotionally numb until they function as efficient but fundamentally altered humans. The most unfortunate experience, increasingly erratic symptom patterns, alternating between apparent recovery and catastrophic psychological collapse without predictable pattern. The most extreme trauma responses sometimes lead to actions that violate military discipline, including desertion, substance abuse, violence against comrades or officers, or suicide. Egyptian military records document these behaviors without connecting them to combat exposure, treating them as simple discipline problems requiring punishment rather than manifestations of psychological injury requiring treatment. The harsh penalties for these infractions, flogging, branding, execution, add judicial trauma to existing psychological burdens, creating cycles of deteriorating behavior and escalating punishment that typically end in death, either by official execution or suicidal behavior, thinly disguised as battlefield recklessness. Some trauma-affected veterans find partial healing through religious dedication. Temple service offers structured environment, clear purpose, and spiritual framework for processing traumatic experiences. Various Egyptian deities offer particular appeal to troubled veterans. Sekhmet, the destroyer who also heals. Ptah, the creator who brings order from chaos. Osiris, who conquered death itself. The combination of ritual structure, communal support, and meaningful narrative helps some veterans reconstruct psychological stability. However, this path remains available primarily to those with sufficient social standing to secure temple positions, excluding most common soldiers from this potential avenue of recovery. The long-term trajectory for most combat-traumatized Egyptian veterans trends toward deterioration rather than recovery. Without effective treatment interventions, trauma symptoms typically persist or worsen over time. Physical health often deteriorates in parallel with psychological function, as sleep disturbance, chronic stress, and substance abuse create progressive physiological damage. Social connections continue to erode as behavior becomes increasingly difficult for family and community to tolerate. Economic function suffers from inability to maintain consistent work performance, leading to poverty that further limits access to whatever support systems might exist. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of ancient combat trauma is its historical invisibility. The psychological casualties of Egyptian warfare leave few archaeological traces, their suffering undocumented in official records and unmarked by distinctive burial patterns. Temple carvings depict physical wounds received in glorious battle, but never the thousand-yard stare of the traumatized veteran. The psychological cost of empire building, the minds shattered alongside the bodies sacrificed, remains uncounted and unacknowledged, visible only through careful reading between the lines of surviving texts and contextual understanding of universal human responses to extreme stress. Modern understanding of combat trauma as a neurobiological injury, rather than character weakness or spiritual affliction, offers cold comfort across the millennia. The Egyptian soldiers' psychological wounds were no less real or devastating for being misunderstood. Their suffering followed patterns familiar to combat veterans throughout human history, their symptoms recognizable across the vast temporal distance separating their experience from modern warfare. The hidden wounds of ancient combat claimed as many lives as bronze weapons, just more slowly and with less acknowledgement of the true cause of death. These psychological burdens accompanied you whether you continued military service or attempted return to civilian life. But for many Egyptian soldiers, a darker fate awaited, one that offered neither the dubious glory of battlefield death nor the complicated challenge of living with trauma. Capture by enemy forces presented the most feared outcome of military service, introducing possibilities more terrifying than either death or psychological suffering. Death and psychological trauma aren't the worst outcomes of battle. The most dreaded fate for any Egyptian soldier is capture, becoming a prisoner of war in a world where concepts like the Geneva Convention remain millennia in the future. Enemy capture isn't just a temporary setback or a pause in your military service. It's a fundamental status change that strips away your identity, your rights, and usually your future. The transformation from soldier to prisoner happens in an instant, but creates consequences that last a lifetime. If you're fortunate enough to have much lifetime remaining. Your training acknowledges this reality without directly addressing it. Officers don't lecture explicitly about the horrors of captivity, but the message permeates military culture through subtle and not so subtle means. Veterans share whispered stories of what happened to captured comrades. Unit histories memorialize those who chose suicide over surrender. Religious instruction emphasizes the importance of proper Egyptian burial for the afterlife, something unlikely for those who die in enemy hands. The unspoken but unmistakable lesson: better to die fighting than be taken alive. The initial moments of capture set the tone for what follows. Enemies who've just been trying to kill you and watching their comrades fall to Egyptian weapons aren't inclined toward compassion when you suddenly become defenseless. The immediate post-capture period typically involves brutal physical assault, not just from anger, but as deliberate policy to establish total dominance and eliminate resistance. Many prisoners don't survive this initial phase, their injuries proving fatal before formal captivity even begins. Those who do survive learn immediately that their continued existence depends entirely on captors' whims rather than any recognized rights or protections. Physical restraint methods vary by capturing culture but share the common goals of preventing escape while maximizing discomfort. Hands bound painfully behind backs, sometimes with additional connection to neck bindings so that any struggle causes self-strangulation. Ankles shackled with rope or primitive metal restraints, tight enough to allow shuffling movement but preventing running. Some captors use more elaborate systems: wooden stocks for hands and neck, bamboo or reed cages, or specialized restraint devices designed specifically for prisoner control. These aren't just practical security measures. They're deliberately humiliating and painful, part of the psychological breaking process that begins immediately upon capture. The journey from battlefield to whatever fate awaits delivers its own specialized torments. Prisoners typically march bound together in lines or groups, given minimal water and no food, forced to maintain pace, regardless of injuries or exhaustion. Those who fall are either abandoned to die or killed outright as examples. The route deliberately passes through populated areas where civilians can observe, abuse, and humiliate enemy captives. This serves multiple purposes: demonstrating military success to the population, allowing civilians whose communities suffered during fighting to feel vicarious revenge, and further breaking prisoners' spirit through public degradation. Egyptian treatment of captured enemies establishes the standard you can expect if captured yourself. Each culture generally reciprocates the practices of their adversaries. Egyptian victory monuments proudly depict bound captives presented to Pharaoh, sometimes showing gruesome details of their treatment. The Medinet Habu inscriptions of Ramesses III show enemy prisoners with their tongues torn out or hands severed. Earlier monuments depict prisoners being personally executed by Pharaoh, grasping them by the hair and smashing their heads with a mace. These aren't just artistic conventions, they're documentations of actual practice, though performed ritually with representative captives, rather than the entire prisoner population. Mass execution represents a common fate for ordinary captured soldiers. Egyptian forces sometimes kill all adult male captives after victory, particularly when logistical challenges make prisoner management impractical, or when the campaign involves punitive objectives rather than territorial acquisition. These executions serve practical and symbolic purposes, eliminating potential resistance, terrorizing surviving populations, and providing visible proof of victory. The methods vary in brutality, but not in outcome. Mass beheading creates dramatic visual display, with heads stacked in piles or impaled on spears as territorial markers. Mass burial, sometimes alive, requires less effort while still achieving elimination of captured enemies. The practice of counting enemy dead uses severed hands or phalluses as verification tokens, with scribes recording precise numbers for official reports. If you've participated in Egyptian campaigns, you've witnessed or possibly participated in this grim accounting process. The psychological impact of systematically dismembering dead enemies, or sometimes living prisoners, creates another layer of moral injury for Egyptian soldiers. The knowledge that the same fate likely awaits you if captured adds personal terror to professional revulsion. Not all prisoners face immediate execution. Many are preserved for economically practical exploitation through enslavement. Enemy soldiers with valuable skills, Metalworkers, stonemasons, shipbuilders receive preference for survival based on utility rather than mercy. Others are selected for their physical capabilities, destined for mining operations, construction projects, or agricultural labor. This selection process occurs with cold efficiency, assessing human beings like livestock, with similar disregard for anything beyond productive capacity. Slave labor conditions for captured soldiers ensure few survive long regardless of initial health. Mining operations prove particularly deadly, with prisoners forced to work in suffocating underground conditions, exposed to toxic substances, given minimal sustenance, and driven until collapse. The turquoise mines of Sinai and gold mines of Nubia become notorious for consuming human life, with new prisoners constantly required to replace those worked to death. Construction projects, temples, palaces, fortifications offer marginally better conditions, but still involve crippling physical demands with inadequate nutrition and frequent punishment. Agricultural slavery presents the greatest survival probability, but introduces different torments. Prisoners working fields face less immediate physical danger, but more comprehensive identity erasure. Distributed to estates far from their homelands, separated from fellow captives who might share language and culture, these isolated prisoners experience forced assimilation and cultural obliteration. Their children, if any are permitted, grow up as Egyptians with no knowledge of their father's origins. Within a generation, the original identity vanishes completely, a form of cultural death that supplements physical elimination. Sexual exploitation affects prisoners of both genders, but manifests differently. Female captives face systematic rape and forced concubinage, documented matter-of-factly in campaign records as one category of plunder, alongside livestock and valuables. Male prisoners experience sexual violence as both punishment and dominance demonstration, with societal attitudes toward male sexual victimization ensuring additional psychological damage through shame. Egyptian cultural standards regarding sexuality create complex hierarchies of violation, with specific acts carrying different levels of degradation for victims. Knowledge that enemies likely share similar frameworks makes anticipation of such treatment particularly terrifying. Religious and cultural humiliation forms another dimension of prisoner treatment. Enemies are forced to witness the destruction of their religious symbols, sometimes compelled to participate in desecration of their own sacred objects. Prisoners must show obeisance to Egyptian gods, performing rituals that violate their native religious prohibitions. These forced violations of cultural and spiritual identity prove more destroying to some prisoners than physical torture, creating a sense of irrevocable corruption that follows even those who somehow survive and return home. Psychological torture techniques demonstrate disturbing sophistication across ancient cultures. Captors understand that uncertainty creates compliance, leading to deliberately inconsistent treatment. Unpredictable alternation between minimal decency and extreme cruelty keeps prisoners permanently off balance. False hope becomes a control mechanism, with occasional suggestions of potential release or ransoming that never materializes. Forced betrayal of fellow prisoners, selecting who receives food or who suffers punishment, destroys group solidarity that might otherwise sustain captives through their ordeal. Ransom systems exist for certain categories of prisoners, primarily officers or soldiers from wealthy families. These arrangements operate with varying degrees of formality depending on the civilizations involved. Between major powers like Egypt and Hittite Empire, diplomatic frameworks might facilitate organized exchanges. With smaller states or tribal entities, ransoming operates through intermediaries, merchants or professional negotiators who extract substantial fees from both sides. For common soldiers without financial resources or valuable skills, ransom possibilities remain theoretical rather than practical, a hope that sustains them through initial captivity, but gradually transforms into bitter recognition of their actual value. The rare prisoner who survives and returns to Egypt faces complex reintegration challenges. Official attitude toward returned captives ranges from suspicion to outright hostility. Military authorities question their conduct before capture, their behavior during captivity, and their potential compromise by enemy influence. Religious officials worry about spiritual contamination from exposure to foreign deities and practices. Community members, including family, often view returned prisoners with uncomfortable mixture of pity and disgust, unsure how to relate to someone who has experienced circumstances beyond normal understanding. Archaeological evidence of prisoner treatment appears in several forms across Egyptian history. Mass graves containing bodies with bound hands, traumatic injuries, and evidence of systematic execution appear near battlefields and campaign routes. Skeletal remains showing signs of extreme physical stress, malnutrition, and untreated injuries emerge from mining sites and construction areas known to have employed prisoner labor. Artistic depictions on temple walls and commemorative monuments show standardized representations of bound captives, often with accompanying hieroglyphic text explicitly describing their fate. These physical records confirm the textual accounts, creating a comprehensive picture of prisoner treatment practices maintained consistently across centuries of Egyptian military operations. The cultural attitude toward prisoners reflects broader ancient perspectives on warfare. Captured enemies are not seen as unfortunate combatants deserving humane treatment, but as spiritually and culturally contaminated beings whose defeat demonstrates divine rejection. Their suffering is not just permitted, but required, a necessary demonstration of Egyptian supremacy and foreign inferiority. This worldview appears in religious texts, military documents, and artistic representations, creating consistent justification for treatment that modern standards would consider war crimes, but ancient participants viewed as natural and appropriate. For you as an Egyptian soldier, the existence of these prisoner treatment practices creates a dual psychological burden. You witness and perhaps participate in the mistreatment of enemy captives, creating one form of moral injury. Simultaneously, you carry the knowledge that identical or worse fate awaits you if captured, generating deep anticipatory trauma that shapes battlefield decisions and post-combat psychology. This burden continues whether you remain in military service or return to civilian life, another invisible wound carried by those who survive Egypt's endless wars. But for the fortunate majority who neither die in battle nor suffer enemy capture, military service eventually transitions toward conclusion, whether through fulfillment of service obligation, medical discharge, or aging beyond combat utility. This transition brings its own challenges, but also the possibility of recognition and reward for years of service to Pharaoh and empire, though the reality of these rewards rarely matches their promise in recruitment narratives. If you've managed to survive battles without crippling wounds, escaped psychological collapse, and avoided enemy capture, you might reasonably expect substantial rewards for your service to Egypt. After all, temple walls and royal proclamations endlessly celebrate military victory and the brave warriors who secure Egypt's greatness. The reality, as with most aspects of military life, falls crushingly short of the propaganda. The rewards for military service, like the rations, equipment, and medical care, operate on a strict hierarchy that leaves common soldiers grasping for crumbs, while officers and elites feast on recognition. Military payment during active service follows a surprisingly standardized system across Egyptian history. Common soldiers receive a combination of basic provisions: food, minimal clothing, equipment maintenance, and periodic payment in kind: grain, oil, occasional luxury items like honey or wine, and small quantities of copper. These payments arrive with bureaucratic irregularity, sometimes months behind schedule, sometimes not at all if campaign logistics become complicated. The quantities barely support individual subsistence, let alone families left behind in Egypt. The official justification that the army provides food and shelter, making additional compensation unnecessary, ignores the reality that most soldiers maintain family obligations despite their service. Officers naturally receive more substantial compensation, scaled according to rank. A captain might earn 5 to 10 times a common soldier's allowance, while higher commanders receive exponentially more. This disparity reflects Egyptian society's rigid hierarchical structure, but creates predictable resentment among ranks. The most galling aspect isn't simply the quantity difference, but the reliability. Officers' payments arrive first when supplies are limited, with lower ranks receiving reduced portions or nothing when resources are stretched. During failed campaigns or difficult retreats, this pattern becomes particularly evident, with command staff maintaining their comforts while common soldiers starve. The famous Gold of Valor, golden flies or lion pendants awarded for exceptional bravery, represents the most prestigious military decoration in ancient Egypt. These awards receive prominent mention in tomb inscriptions and biographical texts of recipients, suggesting genuine status value. However, their distribution reveals predictable patterns of privilege. Officers receive these honors at dramatically higher rates than common soldiers, regardless of actual battlefield contribution. When ordinary soldiers do receive such recognition, it typically follows extraordinary acts witnessed by high-ranking individuals who have specific reasons for acknowledging them: political connections, family relationships, or unusual circumstances requiring public morale building. Land grants form the most substantial theoretical reward for military service. In various periods, Egyptian administration assigns agricultural plots to veterans, providing both livelihood and social status. These distributions occur most extensively during military expansion periods, when newly conquered territories require loyal settlement. The Middle and New Kingdoms formalize this system, with documentary evidence showing standardized allotments based on rank and service duration. For many common soldiers, the promise of land ownership represents their primary motivation for surviving their service term, a chance to secure family prosperity beyond what ordinary civilian life might offer. The reality of these land grants, however, contains multiple disappointments. The quality of assigned land varies dramatically, with officers receiving fertile, well-irrigated plots, while common soldiers get marginal territories requiring extensive development before becoming productive. Location matters equally. Veterans might receive technically sufficient acreage, but in remote areas, far from markets, water sources, or protection. Administrative corruption further complicates matters, with local officials sometimes reassigning veteran lands to political favorites or demanding excessive taxes that effectively negate the grant's benefit. Some veterans discover their theoretical land exists only on papyrus records, with actual territory already occupied by established residents unwilling to surrender their claims. For soldiers from agricultural backgrounds, the vast majority in most periods, land grants at least match their pre-military skills. However, those from urban areas or specialized crafts often lack the knowledge to effectively work their allotments. The military provides no transition training, expecting veterans to somehow transform from warriors to farmers overnight. Many fail in this transition, eventually selling their lands at disadvantageous prices to wealthy landowners who accumulate these properties into larger holdings. The system that theoretically creates independent veteran farmers frequently results instead in desperate tenant workers, barely surviving on lands they nominally received as reward for service. Tax exemptions accompany land grants in some periods, supposedly allowing veterans to establish themselves before bearing normal civic burdens. These exemptions typically expire after fixed periods, 3 to 5 years in most documented cases. However, local tax collectors often forget these exemptions or apply creative interpretations that effectively negate them. Without powerful patrons to enforce their rights, common veterans find themselves paying special assessments, emergency contributions, or other euphemistically named extractions that maintain revenue flow regardless of their theoretical exempt status. Plunder represents the most immediate and tangible reward of successful campaigns. Egyptian military administration develops sophisticated systems for collecting, cataloging, and distributing captured goods. The process begins immediately after battle, with designated officials tallying everything from precious metals to livestock to enslaved prisoners. Distribution follows explicit hierarchical formulas, Pharaoh claims the largest portion, typically at least 50%. Temples receive significant percentages for divine blessing of the campaign, and commanding officers take substantial shares. By the time division reaches common soldiers, the remaining portion has dwindled dramatically, divided among vastly larger numbers of recipients. The typical common soldier's plunder share from even a successful campaign might amount to a few small trinkets, perhaps a captured weapon or tool, maybe a modest quantity of copper or silver, occasionally a share in a captive slave, usually requiring multiple soldiers to jointly own a single prisoner. The dramatic treasure hoards depicted in temple reliefs and official accounts never reach those who actually secured the victory through direct combat. This reality creates another form of bitter knowledge that separates veterans from civilians who believe the propaganda narratives of wealthy soldiers returning from foreign campaigns. Social status theoretically improves through military service, particularly during periods when Egypt actively expands its territory. Veterans can claim connection to national glory, participation in events commemorated on temple walls, and service to divine pharaoh. In some communities, especially those with strong military traditions or located near training centers, this status carries genuine social capital. Veterans receive preferred treatment at local celebrations, religious ceremonies, or community decisions. Their military experience translates to respect and influence beyond what their economic position might otherwise warrant. This social benefit proves highly variable, however. In many communities, particularly agricultural villages focused on immediate survival needs, military service receives acknowledgement but limited practical respect. A veteran with fertile fields and strong oxen commands more genuine deference than one with battle scars and military decorations, but minimal productive capacity. The social value of military service also diminishes with time. Recent campaigns receive recognition, while participation in battles from previous decades fades from community memory. Most veterans discover that initial homecoming respect gradually yields to evaluation based on current contribution rather than past service. Medical support for aging veterans or those with non-disabling injuries technically exists but functions minimally. Some temple complexes maintain facilities for wounded veterans, particularly those injured in high-profile campaigns that received royal attention. However, these institutions operate with limited resources stretched across far more applicants than they can accommodate. Selection frequently depends on connections, bribes, or political considerations, rather than need severity. For most injured veterans, long-term care becomes a family responsibility, with wives, children, and extended relatives bearing the burden of supporting those whose bodies were broken in Pharaoh's service. Official commemoration systematically erases common soldiers from historical memory. Temple reliefs, victory stelae, and royal inscriptions depict Pharaoh as the primary warrior, sometimes acknowledging named generals or favored elites, but never individual common soldiers. The thousands who died securing victories become abstract numerical notes, if mentioned at all. This erasure extends to burial practices. While officers might receive tombs with military career inscriptions, common soldiers receive minimal funerary treatment regardless of their contribution to Egyptian military success. The fundamental injustice of this arrangement rarely receives acknowledgement within Egyptian society, accepted as natural order rather than deliberate choice. Some pharaohs recognize the practical value of veteran support, establishing specific programs during their reigns. Ramesses II, particularly after the near disaster at Kadesh, expands veteran land grants and establishes settlement communities with improved infrastructure. Thutmose III creates dedicated temple positions for disabled veterans from his numerous campaigns. These initiatives represent exceptions rather than standard practice, typically emerging from specific strategic needs rather than genuine concern for veteran welfare. When these pharaohs die, their programs often die with them, leaving veterans dependent on the priorities of new rulers, potentially less invested in military support. The contrast between official propaganda and veteran reality creates a distinctive bitterness among those who survive Egypt's wars. Temple walls show triumphant soldiers receiving gold from grateful pharaohs. Royal inscriptions praise the bravery and sacrifice of Egypt's warriors. Religious texts promise divine rewards for those who defend Ma'at against foreign chaos. Against these lofty claims, veterans experience bureaucratic indifference, administrative corruption, and public amnesia about their service once immediate dangers recede. This disconnect doesn't typically produce organized resistance. Egyptian society provides insufficient space for such expression, but instead creates a quiet, corrosive cynicism that separates veterans from the society they supposedly defended. For career soldiers who serve multiple campaigns across decades, the accumulated rewards can eventually provide modest security. Through careful management of periodic payments, judicious investment of plunder shares, and cultivation of connections with higher-ranking officers, these professional warriors sometimes achieve stable positions for their final years. Their advanced military knowledge often leads to training roles or advisory positions with reasonable compensation and limited physical demands. However, these outcomes represent a small minority of cases, visible exceptions that military recruiters highlight, while ignoring the far more common pattern of struggling veterans receiving minimal practical benefit from their service. The final irony of military reward systems lies in their minimal difference from civilian outcomes. After years of training, combat, hardship, and psychological trauma, most veterans end their lives in roughly the same economic position as comparable civilians who never served. The theoretical advantages, land grants, status, specialized skills, rarely translate to significant practical improvement in quality of life. The sacrifices demanded by military service receive acknowledgement in words, monuments, and ceremonies, but seldom in the material support that might genuinely honor those sacrifices. This reality constitutes perhaps the cruelest aspect of Egyptian military service, not the suffering itself, which has clear purpose, but the emptiness of the promised compensation for that suffering. As you move through Egyptian society as an aging veteran, your decorations tarnished, your land grant perhaps lost or diminished, your body bearing the accumulated damage of campaigns long faded from public memory, you experience one final transformation. You become invisible, not as a soldier among civilians, but as a living reminder of promises unfulfilled, of glorious campaigns that secured territory and treasure for pharaoh and temples, but somehow never generated the prosperity promised to those who bled for those victories. Your individual story, like those of countless veterans before you, fades from official record, preserved, if at all, only in family memory, soon to vanish with your generation's passing. In life, you were a tool of empire, used, damaged, and discarded when your utility ended. In death, you face a final injustice. Historical erasure so complete, it borders on metaphysical violence. The men who built and defended ancient Egypt through blood and suffering vanish from the official record with breathtaking efficiency. What remains instead is a carefully constructed fiction, bearing almost no resemblance to the lived reality of actual Egyptian soldiers. This systematic obliteration transforms individual sacrifice into anonymous backdrop, rendering millions of military lives essentially invisible to both contemporary society and historical memory. Official records of Egyptian military campaigns present a standardized narrative structure regardless of actual events. Pharaoh, guided by divine inspiration and personally embodying martial perfection, leads an army described in numerical but not individual terms. Enemies are defeated through royal prowess, supported by divine intervention. Victory brings territorial expansion, resource acquisition, and enhanced prestige. Soldiers appear in these accounts as undifferentiated masses, their actions attributed to Pharaoh's leadership rather than individual courage or skill. In the official history, Pharaoh doesn't command armies. He wields them like weapons, with no more individual recognition than a bow or chariot might receive. Temple carvings and victory monuments reinforce this narrative visually. Battle scenes show Pharaoh in dramatically enlarged scale compared to both enemies and his own troops. Royal figures appear in dynamic, heroic poses, smiting enemies, driving chariots, loosing arrows, while Egyptian soldiers formed geometric background patterns, visually identical and stripped of individual characteristics. These artistic conventions aren't merely aesthetic choices. They're deliberate ideological statements about the relationship between ruler and ruled, between divine king and expendable subjects. The message is unmistakable. Individual soldiers matter so little they don't even deserve distinct visual representation. For elite military officers, the historical record offers limited exceptions to this erasure. High-ranking commanders sometimes receive mention in campaign accounts, particularly those with royal connections or involvement in especially significant victories. Their tombs might include military career details, listing campaigns, positions held, and royal recognition received. Some officer tombs include scenes of military life, providing rare glimpses of training, camp activities, or non-combat aspects of campaigns. These exceptions, however, apply almost exclusively to the nobility who commanded, rather than the commoners who fought and died in vastly greater numbers. Archaeological evidence offers more democratic testimony than official records, though still fragmentary and often difficult to interpret. Mass graves near battle sites contain remains of common soldiers, sometimes with evidence of battlefield injuries or hasty burial. Military outposts and fortress sites yield artifacts of daily military life, broken weapons, discarded equipment, personal items lost or abandoned. Skeletal remains from non-elite cemeteries show patterns of injury and physical stress consistent with military service. These material traces provide limited but crucial evidence of the actual humans behind Egypt's military achievements, suggesting through bones and broken pottery what official records deliberately obscure. The most extensive archaeological evidence comes from military disaster rather than success. The Hittite ambush of Egyptian forces at Kadesh left substantial material record despite royal propaganda transforming near defeat into claimed victory. Similarly, failed campaigns against Nubian kingdoms or Libyan tribal confederations sometimes resulted in hasty retreats that abandoned equipment, provisions, and fallen soldiers, creating archaeological deposits that contradict triumphant official narratives. In these failures, paradoxically, common soldiers achieve greater historical visibility than in celebrated victories, their abandoned remains telling truths that temple inscriptions carefully conceal. Soldier burials reveal significant disparities based on rank and status. Officers receive proper tombs with appropriate funerary equipment, inscriptions recording military service, and sometimes distinctive military items included among grave goods. Common soldiers, if they receive formal burial at all, typically enter the archaeological record as simple interments with minimal grave goods and no identifying inscriptions. Mass casualties from major battles often receive even less consideration. Hasty communal graves with bodies arranged with practical efficiency rather than ritual propriety. Foreign campaigns frequently necessitate battlefield burial or cremation, practices considered spiritually problematic within Egyptian religious frameworks, but unavoidable given logistical realities. These burial practices create enduring spiritual consequences within Egyptian theological understanding. Proper funerary ritual, appropriate tomb preparation, and correct magical texts and equipment are essential for successful transition to the afterlife. Without these elements, the soldier's spirit faces potential oblivion or eternal wandering, a second death more permanent than physical demise. This religious understanding adds particular cruelty to the common soldier's fate. Having sacrificed during life for Egypt's security and expansion, they face spiritual abandonment after death, denied the essential requirements for eternal existence through the same administrative neglect that limited their earthly rewards. Foreign perspectives occasionally provide counterbalance to Egyptian official narratives. Hittite, Assyrian, or Mitanni records describe Egyptian military actions from enemy viewpoints, sometimes with surprisingly detailed observations about Egyptian tactics, equipment, or troop composition. These external accounts rarely focus on individual common soldiers either. but they sometimes contradict Egyptian claims about battle outcomes, force composition, or campaign effectiveness. Letters between foreign rulers occasionally mention captured Egyptian soldiers, ransom arrangements, or prisoner exchanges, providing rare acknowledgement of individual fates otherwise lost to history. Literary texts offer occasional glimpses of military life absent from official records. The Tale of Sinuhe includes observations of military service and combat, albeit focused on an elite protagonist rather than common soldiers. Various wisdom texts include brief references to military hardship, sometimes advising readers to avoid service if possible, or offering guidance on surviving its challenges. Poetic compositions occasionally praise warriors in abstract terms, though again typically focusing on leadership rather than ordinary combatants. These literary references, while limited, at least acknowledge the human dimension of military service in ways official histories deliberately avoid. Linguistic evidence reveals interesting patterns in how Egyptian society conceptualized soldiers. Different terms designate career versus conscripted troops, native versus foreign auxiliaries, and various specialized military roles. These terminological distinctions suggest more nuanced understanding of military composition than temple inscriptions might indicate. Similarly, surviving administrative documents, ration lists, equipment inventories, assignment rosters, reveal bureaucratic systems that necessarily acknowledged individual soldiers, at least as accounting units requiring specific resource allocation. This administrative visibility, however, rarely translates to commemorative recognition or historical remembrance. The limited representation of common soldiers in Egyptian historical record contrasts sharply with some contemporary or later military cultures. Mycenaean Greek traditions, while still emphasizing leadership, include greater recognition of individual warrior accomplishment. Later, Greek and Roman military systems developed more elaborate commemoration practices for common soldiers, including named memorial inscriptions, standardized funerary benefits, and literary traditions celebrating ordinary courage. This contrast suggests Egyptian erasure of common soldiers represents deliberate ideological choice rather than technological or conceptual limitation. A systematic effort to maintain focus on divine kingship rather than human contribution. For families of fallen soldiers, this official erasure creates particular cruelty. Without formal notification systems or casualty records, families of the missing face uncertain waiting rather than definitive closure. A soldier who doesn't return might be dead, captured, deserted, or simply reassigned without communication. Temple inscriptions celebrating total victory provide no information about specific casualties. Administrative records might eventually confirm deaths through updated tax or census information, but such bureaucratic acknowledgement offers little emotional resolution and no commemoration of sacrifice. The uncertainty often continues for years, creating a distinctive form of ambiguous grief for military families across Egyptian history. The psychological impact of anticipated erasure affects soldiers themselves. Awareness that your potential death will receive no recognition, that your name will appear on no monument, that your sacrifice will be attributed to Pharaoh's glory rather than your courage. This knowledge creates existential burden beyond the physical dangers of military service. Some evidence suggests soldiers develop their own commemorative practices in response, including informal unit memorials, battlefield markings, or verbal traditions preserving names and deeds of fallen comrades. These grassroots remembrance efforts leave minimal archaeological trace, but represented crucial psychological countermeasure against official erasure. Modern archaeological approaches increasingly attempt to recover the experiences of common Egyptian soldiers through innovative methodological approaches. Bioarchaeological analysis of skeletal remains provides evidence of activity patterns, nutritional status, injury types, and health challenges associated with military service. Experimental archaeology reconstructs equipment function, formation movements, and practical aspects of military life. Spatial analysis of campaign routes, fortress placements, and battle sites creates more comprehensive understanding of the logistical realities facing Egyptian armies. These approaches offer partial remedy to ancient erasure, though still limited by available evidence and interpretive challenges. Popular modern representations perpetuate distorted understanding of Egyptian military reality. Films, television programs, and historical fiction typically present the same pharaoh-centered narrative found in ancient propaganda, with common soldiers reduced to decorative background elements if shown at all. The distinctive Egyptian aesthetic, with its visually striking chariots, exotic weapons, and dramatic royal imagery, lends itself to spectacular portrayal that reinforces rather than challenges ancient propaganda perspectives. Even supposedly educational presentations often uncritically repeat temple inscription claims about battle counts, casualty figures, or campaign achievements that actual evidence contradicts. The ultimate historical tragedy lies in recognizing that ancient Egypt's monumental achievements, the temples, fortresses, expanded territories, and trade networks secured through military action, resulted primarily from the unacknowledged sacrifice of countless common soldiers. The archaeological wonders that define ancient Egyptian civilization, for modern observers, emerged from social systems that deliberately erased the individuals who made those achievements possible. The magnificent structures that survive provide no space for the names, experiences, or memories of those whose blood and suffering secured the resources, territories, and stability necessary for monumental construction. As you near the end of your military service, whether through retirement, disability, or approaching death, you confront this final reality. Your individual experience, the training, the campaigns, the wounds, the hardships, the occasional moments of pride or camaraderie, will vanish from historical memory as completely as footprints in desert sand after windstorm. The Egypt you served will continue celebrating victories without acknowledging those who achieved them, constructing temples commemorating divine kingship without mentioning the human costs of imperial expansion. Your sacrifices, like those of countless soldiers before you, become invisible foundation beneath visible monuments, essential but deliberately unseen. This erasure represents the final and perhaps most profound brutality of ancient Egyptian military service. Beyond the physical hardships, beyond the psychological trauma, beyond the inadequate compensation, lies this ultimate injury, the systematic removal of your existence from historical record and commemorative tradition. You fought, suffered, and possibly died for an empire that would not even remember your name. A civilization that considered individual soldiers so insignificant they deserved no place in its elaborate remembrance practices. The cruelest aspect of Egyptian military life may not be what happened during service, but what happened afterward. Nothing. No recognition, no monument, no memory, just silence where acknowledgement of sacrifice should be. The brutal reality of the ancient Egyptian soldier's existence stands in stark contrast to the gleaming images we've inherited through carefully crafted propaganda. The magnificent temples, the dramatic victory scenes, the heroic depictions of pharaohs smiting enemies, these enduring images tell a story deliberately designed to conceal rather than reveal the true nature of Egypt's military machine. Behind these grand facades lie the broken bodies, traumatized minds, and erased identities of countless men who built and defended one of history's most celebrated civilizations through their anonymous suffering. This disconnect between representation and reality isn't unique to ancient Egypt. Throughout human history, societies have glorified warfare while obscuring its human costs, celebrated victory while ignoring its price, and memorialized leaders while forgetting followers. What makes Egypt distinctive is the extraordinary effectiveness of its propaganda system. So powerful, it continues influencing modern perception thousands of years after the last pharaoh commanded the last Egyptian army. When we envision Egyptian warfare today, we still see essentially what royal artists wanted us to see: the sanitized, pharaoh-centered version, rather than the blood-soaked, chaotic reality experienced by ordinary participants. The archaeological record occasionally breaks through this carefully constructed narrative, offering glimpses of the actual humans behind Egypt's military achievements. Mass graves containing hundreds of broken bodies, each representing an individual with hopes, fears, and a life beyond their military service. Skeletal remains showing healed fractures, chronic joint damage, and distinctive stress patterns created by years of weapons training and combat experience. Personal items, a carved amulet, a gaming piece, a copper ring, suggesting moments of individuality within the homogenizing military system. These material traces provide fragmentary but powerful counter-narrative to official histories, reminding us that armies consist of individuals rather than undifferentiated masses. What emerges from both archaeological evidence and critical reading of Egyptian sources is a military system of remarkable durability but profound human cost. From the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom and beyond, Egypt maintained armies capable of both defensive security and offensive expansion. These forces secured resources, controlled trade routes, established imperial boundaries, and projected power across significant portions of the ancient world. The monuments celebrating these achievements stand today as testament to their effectiveness, even as they obscure the means by which that effectiveness was achieved. The systematic exploitation of common soldiers treated as expendable resources, rather than valued contributors. The Egyptian military experience reflected and reinforced the broader social structure from which it emerged. In a society where hierarchy determined every aspect of life, where divine kingship justified absolute authority, where religious doctrine emphasized order and submission, the military naturally developed systems that prioritized collective function over individual welfare. Soldiers weren't mistreated because of particular cruelty or unusual disregard. They were mistreated because the entire civilization operated on principles that valued institutional stability over human experience. The soldier's expendability wasn't exception, but embodiment of core Egyptian social principles. This contextual understanding doesn't diminish the harshness of military life, but helps explain its persistence across millennia. Egyptian soldiers endured brutality not because they were uniquely tolerant of suffering, but because alternatives simply didn't exist within their conceptual universe. Resistance against military service meant challenging not just immediate authority, but cosmic order itself, placing oneself in opposition to Ma'at, the fundamental principle of rightness underpinning Egyptian civilization. Given this religious and social framework, most accepted their military obligation despite its hardships, finding meaning in service to greater purpose, even when that purpose granted them minimal recognition. For modern observers, the Egyptian military system reveals uncomfortable truths about civilization's foundations. The architectural wonders, artistic masterpieces, and technological innovations that define ancient Egypt's contribution to human heritage emerged from a social system built on systematic exploitation. The temples celebrating divine harmony required military force to acquire resources and maintain control. The elaborate tomb complexes ensuring eternal life for elites depended on security provided by soldiers who themselves received minimal funerary consideration. The stability allowing artistic and intellectual development rested on the deterrent effect of Egyptian armies ready to crush opposition through overwhelming violence. This recognition demands nuanced rather than simplistic response. Acknowledging the human costs of ancient achievement doesn't diminish cultural accomplishment, but completes our understanding of its context. Egyptian civilization wasn't uniquely exploitative. All ancient societies operated through systems modern standards would consider oppressive. The distinctive aspect of Egypt lies not in the existence of military exploitation, but in its effectiveness, durability, and the extraordinary propaganda system that continues influencing perception thousands of years after its creation. Understanding the reality behind this propaganda doesn't reduce appreciation for Egyptian achievement, but grounds that appreciation in human rather than mythological terms. The experience of Egyptian soldiers also offers perspective on warfare's consistency across disparate times and cultures. Despite vast technological differences between Bronze Age combat and modern warfare, the fundamental psychological experience shows disturbing similarities. The terror of battle, the trauma of witnessing mass death, the hardship of campaign conditions, the bureaucratic indifference toward individual welfare. These elements appear with remarkable consistency from ancient Egypt through medieval conflicts to modern warfare. This continuity suggests something fundamental about organized violence that transcends specific cultural contexts or technological capabilities, a persistent human reality beneath warfare's constantly evolving surface features. For individual Egyptian soldiers, these broader historical perspectives offered little comfort. Your experience remained intensely personal, despite its participation in larger patterns. The spear that pierced your comrade's throat represented specific tragedy rather than abstract statistic. The nights spent shivering in desert cold while nursing battle wounds were your nights, your suffering, your endurance. The family left wondering about your fate experienced particular grief rather than generalized historical process. The fundamental humanity of individual experience persists despite systems designed to reduce persons to functions, to transform named individuals into anonymous components within military machinery. This tension between individual experience and institutional erasure creates the essential tragedy of ancient Egyptian military service. The contradiction between personal sacrifice and official invisibility, between human suffering and monumental achievement, between bodily reality and propagandistic representation, generates cognitive dissonance that extends from ancient participants to modern observers. We cannot view Egyptian monuments without tacit awareness of the unacknowledged suffering that created them, yet that awareness remains perpetually incomplete, limited by the very erasure it attempts to recognize. The soldiers who made Egypt's greatness possible remain shadows behind the monuments, present through their absence, visible through the deliberate void where their recognition should exist. As we conclude this examination of ancient Egyptian military life, perhaps the most appropriate memorial for these forgotten warriors lies not in belated monuments, but in restored understanding. By acknowledging the reality behind the propaganda, by recognizing individuals suffering beneath institutional achievement, by restoring humanity to deliberately dehumanized historical participants, we perform an act of remembrance that ancient systems specifically sought to prevent. Against pharaonic insistence that only royal action deserves commemoration, we assert that common lives matter to historical understanding. Against ancient hierarchy that valued elite experience over ordinary suffering, we insist that complete history must include those deliberately excluded from official narrative. The temples, fortresses, and monuments of ancient Egypt still stand, still impress, still testify to remarkable civilization achievement. But between their imposing stones now move the ghosts of those who built and defended them. The anonymous soldiers whose blood, sweat, and shortened lives made possible the structures that deliberately omit their contribution. In acknowledging these ghosts, in recognizing the brutality of their experience and the injustice of their erasure, we don't diminish Egyptian achievement, but complete our understanding of its nature. The true wonder lies not just in what was built, but in fully comprehending the human cost of its building, a cost primarily paid by those who received neither recognition in life nor remembrance in death, the forgotten warriors of ancient Egypt.